Let's settle in for a story tonight. This isn't a tale of kings or glorious battles. Instead, we're taking a journey to a place people only spoke of in whispers. A place that existed beneath the floorboards of the medieval world. A place designed to make you disappear from memory. We're talking about the dungeon. In our modern minds, it's a simple concept, almost a cliché from fantasy movies and games. A dark room, some chains, maybe a bit of straw on the floor. It's a harsh but straightforward place, a temporary stop on a bigger adventure. But the reality of a medieval dungeon was something else entirely. It wasn't just a prison. It was a finely tuned instrument of psychological and physical destruction, a daily routine designed not just to hold you, but to completely unmake you, piece by agonizing piece, long before any trial. Now, dim the lights, find a comfortable position, and maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let the world outside fade away, and allow yourself to sink into the quiet of the room. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, into the cold, dark heart of the past. Your day in a medieval dungeon doesn't begin with a dramatic capture or a sword fight. It starts quietly, with a rough shove down a set of narrow, winding stone stairs. The world of sunlight and fresh air vanishes behind you with the first step into the earth. The air immediately changes. It grows heavy, thick, and damp, clinging to your skin and clothes. Each breath feels colder and wetter than the last, carrying the deep chill of the ground. This is the air that has been breathed by the forgotten and the condemned for generations. Then, the smell arrives. It's not just the musty scent of old stone. It is a complex and horrifying perfume of decay, of unwashed bodies, of sickness, and of profound human misery. It's a smell that gets into your throat and stays there, a constant reminder of your location. You reach the bottom of the stairs. Ahead is a heavy door made of thick, splintered wood and bound with black iron. It looks less like a door and more like a permanent seal, a final statement separating the world of the living from the world of the slowly dying. A guard, his face indifferent and bored, gives you one last push. You stumble forward into a space you cannot see, a void that seems to swallow the little light from the corridor. The air here is even more foul, more stagnant than it was on the stairs. Behind you, the door slams shut. The sound is a deafening boom that echoes off the stone, a physical blow that vibrates through your entire body. It is the sound of your old life ending. There is no ambiguity in that sound. It is a full stop. You hear the final, metallic scrape of a heavy iron bolt sliding into its lock. That is the last familiar noise you will hear for a long time. After that, there is only the sound of the guard's footsteps fading away, leaving you utterly and completely alone in the quiet. And that is when the first and perhaps most powerful horror of the dungeon truly reveals itself. The darkness. This is not the simple darkness of a closed room or a moonless night. This is an absolute, perfect, and suffocating blackness that feels like a physical substance. It presses in on you from all sides, a thick, velvety void that your eyes cannot penetrate. You hold your hand up inches from your face and you see nothing. You feel the warmth of your skin, but the sight is gone, erased by the profound lack of light. For a terrifying moment, your brain might try to convince you that you've gone blind. It searches desperately for a crack of light, a star, a single photon, but finds nothing. This total sensory deprivation is a weapon, and it is brutally effective at disorienting the mind. It immediately destroys your sense of scale and distance. Is the wall in front of you an inch away, or 10 feet? Is the ceiling high above your head, or is it low enough to touch? You have no way of knowing. You are floating in an undefined black space. This is not a passive darkness. It feels active, like a presence in the room with you. It robs you of your surroundings, forcing you to rely on other, more vulnerable senses. The dungeon has taken your sight first, because it is the sense we trust the most. With your vision gone, Your hearing becomes painfully acute. Every tiny sound is magnified, echoing in the void. At first, all you can hear is the frantic pounding of your own heart and the ragged sound of your breathing. But then, you start to hear the dungeon itself. There is a slow, steady dripping sound somewhere in the blackness. Drip, drip, drip. It is a maddeningly regular rhythm that will soon become your only way of marking the passage of time. Each drop is a second of your life, seeping away into the cold stone floor. Then, a different sound reaches you. It is a low, guttural moan from far down the corridor, beyond your cell. It is the sound of someone else's pain, a misery so old and ingrained that it has lost all its energy and become just a constant, weary exhalation. And then you hear the scratching, the tiny, frantic sounds of dozens of little claws on stone. They are the true permanent residents of this place. They are the rats, and this is their kingdom. You are merely a temporary source of food and warmth in their domain. These sounds, the drip, the moan, the scratching, combine to form the symphony of your new existence. There is no escape from them. They will be your constant companions in the dark, a perpetual reminder that you are not alone, but that your company is not human. You decide you must understand your physical space. You cannot remain frozen in place forever. You take a single, shuffling step forward, arms outstretched, your hands trembling as they search for a solid surface in the oppressive darkness. Your foot lands on something soft and wet. You recoil, but there's nowhere to go. You try again, shuffling your feet cautiously across the floor. You realize the ground is not flat stone. It is uneven, lumpy, and it squelches under your weight. It is a slurry of damp earth, old rotting straw, and worse things. Finally, your questing fingers touch a wall, but it is not the dry, rough stone you expected. It is slick with a cold, greasy dampness. It feels coated in a thin layer of slimy growth, a testament to the endless moisture that permeates this underground world. You run your hand along it, trying to get a sense of the size of your cell. The wall is interrupted by gaps and cracks from which the cold, foul air seems to breathe. This place is not a sealed box. It is a porous, living tomb that is slowly decaying around you. The floor is the true horror. It is the physical record of every person who has been here before you. It is a compressed, disgusting carpet of mud, human waste, and the remnants of spoiled food. There is no concept of sanitation or cleaning here. The floor is a toilet. With a sickening jolt, you understand that you will have to sit on this floor. You will have to lie down and sleep on this floor. This cold, wet, and indescribably filthy surface is now your bed, your chair, your dining table, and your entire world. You try to find the cleanest spot, a futile effort in the pitch black. Every inch of the floor feels the same. You eventually give up and slide down the slimy wall, pulling your knees to your chest, trying to make your body as small as possible. You try to keep your clothes from touching the worst of the muck, but it's a losing battle. The dampness from the floor immediately begins to seep into your thin tunic, a persistent, chilling cold that seems to go right to your bones. It's a cold you will never escape. Now a new sensation begins to make itself known. It starts as a single tiny itch on your arm. You scratch it, then another on your leg, and another in your hair. Soon, you feel them everywhere. It is the crawling, biting presence of your new roommates. Fleas, lice, and other biting insects thrive in the filth and dampness of the dungeon. They live in the rotting straw and on the bodies of the rats. And now, they have found a new home in your clothes and on your skin. The itching becomes a constant, maddening torment. You are not just imprisoned, you are being consumed. Slowly, Bite by bite, your body is becoming a feast for the dungeon's smallest inhabitants. There is no way to wash, no way to get clean. You can only endure the constant, crawling irritation as it slowly drives you insane. Hours pass. Or perhaps it is only minutes. In the absolute darkness, time loses all meaning. Your world has shrunk to the slimy wall at your back, the wet filth beneath you, and the constant, maddening itch of 1,000 tiny bites across your entire body. You might try to call out, to scream for the guard, for anyone, but your voice is swallowed by the thick stone walls. It doesn't echo, it just dies, absorbed by the oppressive silence and the damp. You realize quickly that screaming is a waste of precious energy. No one is listening. The world above has already forgotten you. That is the entire purpose of this place. It is an oubliette, a place of forgetting. You are not here to be punished in public. You are here to be erased from existence quietly and efficiently. Sometime later, a day, 2 days, you can't be sure. You hear the bolt on your door scrape open. For a blissful moment, you think you are being released, but the door only opens a few inches, just enough for a wooden bowl to be slid across the filthy floor. The door slams shut again, the bolt driving home. You are left alone with the first meal you've had since your arrival. You crawl on your hands and knees across the disgusting floor, your fingers searching desperately for the bowl in the total darkness. Your hands finally close around it. Inside, you feel a chunk of something hard and a little bit of sloshing liquid. This is the famous bread and water of dungeon lore. But the reality is far from the simple, clean image that phrase might bring to mind. You lift the bread to your nose. It smells sour and musty. You take a hesitant bite. It is hard as a rock and tastes of mold and sawdust. Bakers often mixed flour with cheap fillers, like dried peas, dirt, or wood shavings, to save money on prisoners' rations. But you are starving, so you chew the gritty, foul-tasting substance. It is calories. It is survival. But it is also a source of sickness. This bread is often contaminated with mold or rat droppings, turning your only source of food into a slow-acting poison. Next, you lift the bowl to your lips to drink the water. It is lukewarm and has a metallic, stagnant taste. This water is not drawn from a clean well. It is often from a cistern that collects rainwater, or worse, from a source contaminated by the prison's own sewage. Drinking this water is a terrible gamble. It might quench your thirst for a moment, but it is also a likely source of dysentery and other waterborne diseases. In the dungeon, a simple case of sickness is often a death sentence, with no medicine and no comfort available. As you are eating your miserable meal, you become aware of movement around you in the dark. The rats, drawn by the scent of food, are growing bold. You feel a twitch against your leg, the brush of a furry body as it scurries past, exploring this new development. They are not afraid of you. In this environment, you are the intruder, and you are weak. They will try to steal your food right out of your hands. You must guard your tiny portion of moldy bread and dirty water with a ferocity you didn't know you possessed. This becomes a central part of your daily struggle, not just enduring the cold and the dark, but actively fighting a swarm of hungry, disease-ridden rodents for a few mouthfuls of sustenance that might be poisoning you anyway. It is a perfect, inescapable trap. Let's talk about the jailer. He is not the bumbling, key-jingling guard from the movies, who might be swayed by a sad story. He is likely an underpaid, brutalized man who sees you not as a person, but as a piece of livestock he has to manage. He is your only link to the outside world, but he is not your friend. Your suffering is his job. Your comfort is irrelevant. In fact, making your life more miserable might be a source of entertainment for him, a small moment of power in his own grim existence. Any small comfort you might receive will have to be purchased. If you have family on the outside with money, they might be able to bribe the jailer for an extra piece of bread, a blanket, or even a candle. But these luxuries are rare. and incredibly expensive. Without money, you're entirely at his mercy. And in the depths of a medieval dungeon, mercy is the rarest and most valuable commodity of all. It is a currency that most prisoners simply do not possess. You are worth more to him dead than alive. The days and nights blur into one long, continuous stretch of misery. With no sunlight, your body's natural rhythms are destroyed. You sleep in short, fitful bursts, woken by the cold, the itching of flea bites, or the chilling sound of a rat crawling across your chest. This state of perpetual twilight, where sleep offers no rest and waking brings no clarity, begins to work a terrible magic on your mind. You start to lose your grip on the sequence of events. Did you eat today, or was that yesterday? Was the guard's last visit a few hours ago, or has it been a full cycle of the sun you can no longer see? The lack of external cues, of sunrise and sunset, erases the very framework of a day. Time collapses into a single, unending moment of cold, dark, and itching. Your memories of the outside world, once sharp and clear, begin to feel distant and dreamlike, as if they happened to someone else in another life. The dungeon is not just a physical prison. It is actively rewriting your perception of reality, isolating your consciousness in an eternal, miserable present. It is a slow, methodical erasure of who you used to be, starting with your connection to the simple, predictable rhythm of a day. Let's talk more about the cold. It's not the bracing, clean cold of a winter morning. This is a deep, penetrating dampness that gets into your bones and stays there. Your thin clothes, perpetually moist from the floor and the humid air, offer no protection. They cling to you like a second, icy skin, constantly drawing warmth away from your body. You develop a constant, uncontrollable shiver that racks your frame, exhausting your already limited energy. Your fingers and toes become numb, clumsy things, and you might lose feeling in them for long stretches. This isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. This is the slow, creeping onset of hypothermia, a gradual shutting down of your body's functions. You find yourself curling into the tightest ball possible, a desperate, futile attempt to preserve any speck of body heat. But the stone floor is a relentless heat sink, pulling your life force into the earth, moment by agonizing moment. Hunger becomes a new and defining feature of your existence. It is not the simple hunger of a missed meal. It is a deep, gnawing ache in the pit of your stomach that never, ever goes away. The tiny portion of moldy bread you receive is just enough to keep you alive, but never enough to make you feel full. This chronic starvation has profound effects. Your body begins to consume itself for fuel, starting with fat and then moving on to muscle. You grow noticeably weaker with each passing cycle. Standing up becomes a dizzying effort. Your thoughts become sluggish, circling endlessly around the idea of food. You would fantasize about the simplest things: a hot soup, a piece of fruit, a clean loaf of bread. This obsession with food eclipses all other thoughts, reducing your complex human mind to its most basic animalistic drive, the need to eat. This is another way the dungeon unmakes you. Now, let's consider the concept of the oubliette, a word that comes from the French verb oublier, which means to forget. This was the most extreme form of the dungeon, a place designed not just for imprisonment, but for total and complete erasure. An oubliette was often little more than a deep, bottle-shaped shaft dug straight down into the earth or the castle's foundations. The entrance was a small hole at the top, sometimes covered by a heavy grate or a stone slab. Prisoners weren't led downstairs, they were simply dropped in. The fall itself could be enough to break bones, an initial and brutal welcome to your new home. Once at the bottom, there was no door, no exit, no possibility of escape. You were in a stone bottle, with the only connection to the world being a small patch of darkness, or, if you were lucky, faint light far, far above your head. Life in an oubliette was a distilled version of the dungeon's horrors. The space was incredibly cramped, sometimes not even wide enough to lie down fully. You would be forced to sit or stand in a contorted position for days, weeks, or years. The filth was even more concentrated. With no way to remove waste, you lived in an ever-growing pile of your own misery, shared with rats and insects that could easily get in and out while you could not. Food and water, if they came at all, were simply lowered down in a bucket or dropped from above, often splashing into the muck on the floor. The psychological torment was immense. The knowledge that you were at the bottom of a hole, completely helpless and dependent on the whim of a jailer far above, was a constant, crushing weight on the soul. It was a tomb for the living, the ultimate expression of the desire to make a person simply cease to exist. The sensory deprivation in a place like an oubliette would be even more profound than in a standard cell. The sounds of the castle above would be muffled and distant, ghostly reminders of a world you were no longer part of. You might hear the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer, or the distant cheer of a crowd, sounds that would only deepen your sense of isolation. Your own world would be one of near total silence, broken only by your own breathing and the scuttling of vermin. In this sensory vacuum, the mind, starved for input, begins to create its own reality. You would start to hear things, whispers in the darkness, the voices of loved ones, music that wasn't there. You might even start to see things in the pitch black, faint shapes and fleeting lights, born from the desperate firing of your optic nerves. These hallucinations were not a sign of madness, but a predictable, biological response to an environment designed to break the human mind. Let's turn our attention back to a more common problem: sickness. In the filth of the dungeon, disease was not a risk. It was a certainty. The smallest cut or scratch on your skin, perhaps from a sharp stone in the wall or a rat bite, could quickly become infected. With no way to clean the wound, and surrounded by bacteria, the infection would fester. You would watch, helpless, as your own body turned against you. The area would become red, swollen, and filled with pus. A fever would set in, leaving you shivering and delirious in the dark. Without any form of medicine, not even the simplest herbal remedy, your body would have to fight the infection alone. In your weakened, starved state, this was a battle you were almost certain to lose. A tiny, insignificant injury from the outside world becomes a slow, agonizing death sentence down here in the dark, a testament to how fragile life is without the basics of cleanliness. And then there was the sickness you would ingest. Dysentery, often called the bloody flux, was rampant in medieval prisons. Caused by bacteria in the contaminated water and food, its effects were brutal and swift. It began with severe stomach cramps, followed by a violent and uncontrollable expulsion of everything from your body. In an environment with no toilet, this illness added a new layer of horror and degradation to your existence. But the true danger was dehydration. As your body lost more fluid than it could take in from the foul water provided, you would grow progressively weaker. Your mouth would become dry, your skin would lose its elasticity, and your mind would become confused. It was a wretched, undignified way to die, a complete and total collapse of your body's systems, all caused by a single sip of dirty water. This was a common end for many prisoners, a quiet, gurgling death in the darkness of their cell. Beyond the dramatic illnesses, there were the chronic conditions that developed from the environment itself. The constant dampness and cold would seep into your joints, leading to agonizing arthritis and rheumatism. Your body would ache with a deep, persistent pain that never subsided. The lack of sunlight meant your body could not produce vitamin D, leading to a host of problems. Your bones would weaken, and you might develop conditions like scurvy from the complete absence of fresh food, causing your gums to bleed and your teeth to loosen. Your body was not just being attacked by external forces like disease and vermin. It was slowly falling apart from the inside due to profound nutritional deficiencies and the hostile environment. You were a plant being kept in a dark, cold cellar, slowly withering away from a lack of everything needed to sustain life. Every part of your physiology was under a relentless, multi-pronged assault. The psychological impact of this physical decay cannot be overstated. You would feel your own body failing you, becoming a source of constant pain and weakness. You would lose control over its most basic functions. This sense of helplessness, of being trapped inside a failing vessel, was a powerful tool of torture. It reinforced the idea that you were no longer a capable, autonomous human being. You were reduced to a collection of painful symptoms and base needs. Your identity began to fray. You were not a farmer, a merchant, or a soldier anymore. You were a prisoner. You were a body in pain. You were a stomach that ached with hunger. You were skin that itched, and flesh that was failing. The dungeon stripped away your social identity first. Then it went to work on your physical one, leaving you with nothing but the raw, terrified core of a consciousness trapped in a decaying shell. Let's consider your fellow prisoners. You would likely never see them. They existed only as sounds in the darkness, a disembodied chorus of suffering. From a nearby cell, you might hear a man endlessly weeping, a quiet, heartbroken sound that continues for hours until it fades into exhausted silence. From another direction, you might hear a constant, racking cough, a wet, rattling sound that tells you a man is slowly drowning in his own lungs. Sometimes there would be screams, sudden sharp cries of pain or terror that would jolt you from your stupor, followed by an even more terrifying silence. These sounds were a double-edged sword. On one hand, they were a grim comfort, a reminder that you were not entirely alone in this hell. But on the other hand, they were a constant, brutal reminder of your own fate. Each cough, each sob, was a preview of what was to come for you. There was no camaraderie in this shared suffering. You couldn't speak to these other prisoners, couldn't offer them a word of comfort or receive one in return. The thick stone walls were designed to isolate, turning each cell into its own private universe of misery. This proximity to others, combined with the total inability to connect, created a unique form of psychological torture. You were surrounded by humanity, but were forced to endure your fate in absolute solitude. This phantom community of the damned only served to highlight your own loneliness. You might even come to resent the other prisoners. Their screams might interrupt your precious moments of sleep. Their constant coughing might grate on your nerves. In the desperate calculus of survival, empathy becomes a luxury you can no longer afford. The dungeon fostered a world where other people's pain was just more noise. And what happened when one of those prisoners finally died? You would know it by the change in the sounds. The constant coughing would stop. The weeping would cease. An unnatural quiet would descend from that direction. This silence was often more chilling than the sounds of suffering that preceded it. Then, after a day or two, you would hear the scrape of the bolt on their door, the grunts of the guards, and the sound of a body being dragged unceremoniously down the corridor. There was no dignity in death here. The deceased was just another piece of refuse to be cleared away. The guards would then likely leave the cell empty for a while, a silent, gaping void in the soundscape of the dungeon, before it was filled with a new prisoner, and the cycle of coughing, weeping, or screaming would begin all over again. The rats deserve a deeper look. They were not the timid creatures you might see in a barn. Dungeon rats were a different breed, hardened by generations of survival in this brutal ecosystem. They were large, bold, and utterly without fear of humans. You were not their master, you were a temporary feature of their landscape and a potential source of food. At first they might keep their distance, scurrying in the corners, but as you grew weaker, they would grow bolder. They would run across your legs as you tried to sleep. They would gnaw on your clothes and your hair. The constant threat was that they might start gnawing on you. A sleeping prisoner too weak to move could easily lose a finger or a toe to the relentless chewing of a swarm of hungry rats. You were in a constant, low-grade war with them. This war was one you could not win. They owned the darkness. They knew every crack and crevice in the stone. They could come and go as they pleased. You, on the other hand, were trapped, slow, and increasingly helpless. This inversion of the natural order, where a human becomes prey for a creature like a rat, was deeply psychologically damaging. It was a constant reminder of your lowly, debased status. You were no longer at the top of the food chain. In this subterranean world, you were a vulnerable animal, and these creatures were the apex predators. The simple act of trying to sleep became an act of vigilance, straining your ears in the dark for the telltale scratching sound that meant they were getting too close. Rest was impossible when you knew you were surrounded by dozens of tiny, hungry mouths. Let's imagine you do have family on the outside, family with a little money. They could try to make your life more bearable by bribing the jailer. This was a common and accepted part of the system. It wasn't about justice. It was a business. For a few coins, the jailer might provide you with a luxury like a straw pallet. This sounds simple, but it would be a monumental improvement. A layer of straw, even if it was thin and dirty, would lift you off the cold, wet stone floor. It would provide a small amount of insulation and comfort. However, this straw would quickly become compacted, soaked with dampness, and infested with the same fleas and lice that were already tormenting you. It was a temporary reprieve that soon became just another part of the cell's filth, a constant reminder of a comfort that was fleeting. Another luxury your family might purchase was a candle. A single tallow candle would be an unbelievable gift. For the first time since your arrival, you would be able to see your prison. The flickering flame would push back the oppressive, absolute darkness and reveal the true nature of your cell, the slimy walls, the filthy floor, the cracks in the stone. Seeing it might be even more horrifying than imagining it. But the light would be a profound psychological comfort, a small piece of the sun brought down into the earth. It would allow you to see the rats before they got too close. It would give you a focal point for your attention other than your own misery. But the candle would not last forever. You would watch it burn down, inch by inch, knowing that when its light was extinguished, the perfect, suffocating blackness would rush back in, perhaps feeling even darker than before. The ultimate luxury was better food. For a significant bribe, the jailer might bring you food that wasn't actively poisonous. Perhaps a small loaf of bread made without sawdust, a piece of cheese, or even some watered-down ale. Compared to your usual rations, this would taste like a feast from a king's table. It would provide crucial calories and nutrients, helping to fight off sickness and despair. But this created its own form of torment. It made you dependent on the jailer's greed and your family's resources. It also starkly separated you from the other unseen prisoners. While you ate your piece of cheese, you could still hear the moans of the man next door who was slowly starving to death. This privilege did not lift you out of the dungeon. It just created a more comfortable and perhaps more guilt-ridden cage within it. But what if you were poor? What if you had no one on the outside to pay for your comfort? In that case, you were completely at the mercy of the system. You were a cost, a liability. The jailer had no incentive to keep you alive, let alone comfortable. In fact, your death would be a net gain for him. It would mean one less mouth to feed, no matter how poorly. For the poor prisoner, there were no luxuries. There was no straw, no candle, no clean water. There was only the base level of existence provided by the prison, an existence carefully calculated to be just barely above immediate death, but well within the realm of constant, grinding misery. This two-tiered system of suffering was a core feature of medieval justice. The dungeon was a terrible place for anyone, but for the poor, it was a direct and efficient pipeline to the grave. The passage of seasons, which so defines life on the outside, would be a strange and subtle thing in the dungeon. You would not see the snows of winter, but you would feel them. The deep, penetrating cold of the stone would intensify, becoming an even more aggressive and life-threatening presence. Your breath would plume in the darkness in front of your face. Any water on the floor might freeze into slick patches of ice. Winter in the dungeon was a battle for survival against an enemy you could not see. A slow, relentless siege of cold that claimed the lives of the weakest prisoners. There was no fireplace, no extra blanket, just the slow ebbing of your body's core temperature as the world outside froze over. You would mark the changing of the seasons not by the leaves on the trees, but by the degrees of your own suffering. Summer, conversely, would not bring warmth and relief, but its own unique set of miseries. The underground chambers of the dungeon would remain cool, but the air would become thick, heavy, and suffocatingly humid. The dampness would intensify, causing mold and fungus to grow even more rapidly on the walls and in your clothes. The smell of decay and human waste, which was already overwhelming, would ripen in the heat, becoming an almost physical assault on your senses. Worst of all, the population of insects would explode. Flies, fleas, and other vermin would thrive in the warm, stagnant air, adding a new dimension to your constant torment. Summer did not mean life and light in the dungeon. It meant rot, stench, and a fever pitch of crawling, biting life that was not your own. It was a season of oppressive, sweltering decay. Let's consider the official purpose of your imprisonment. You were not necessarily serving a sentence. In many cases, you were simply being held while awaiting trial or judgment. This period of waiting could be indefinite. It could last for months or even years. The legal system was slow, inefficient, and often corrupt. Your case could be forgotten, your paperwork lost. You were in a state of suspended animation, a legal limbo. This uncertainty was a form of psychological torture all its own. Every time you heard footsteps in the corridor, a small, foolish spark of hope might ignite in your chest. Is this it? Is it my turn to face the magistrate? But day after day, the footsteps would pass your door, and you would be left alone again in the dark, with no end in sight. Hope, in the dungeon, was a dangerous and painful thing. Sometimes, the guards would come for you not for a trial, but for an interrogation. This was a different kind of horror. You would be led from your cell, blinking in the sudden, painful light of a torch, your muscles stiff and weak from disuse. You would be taken to a different chamber, one that might contain tools and instruments whose purpose was singular and terrifying. The goal here was not justice. It was confession. Under medieval law, a confession was considered the highest form of proof, and officials were legally permitted to use quote 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 quote. The methods of this persuasion were varied and gruesome, designed to inflict the maximum amount of pain without necessarily killing you. The fear of this event, the knowledge that it could happen at any time, was a constant, dark cloud hanging over your daily existence in the cell. The interrogation would not be a quick affair. It was a methodical process. They might start with simple threats, describing in cold, detached detail what they were going to do to you. This psychological intimidation was often enough to break people. If that failed, they would move to the instruments. The rack, designed to stretch your limbs until your joints dislocated. The thumb screws, which would slowly crush your fingers. Water torture, which simulated the feeling of drowning over and over again. Each method was designed to attack a different part of the body, to create a symphony of agony. The goal was to push you to a point where the pain of the present was so overwhelming that you would say or do anything to make it stop, even if it meant confessing to a crime you did not commit. The cruel genius of this system was that your own body became the instrument of your conviction. Your inability to withstand the pain was legally interpreted as a sign of your guilt. An innocent person, it was believed, would be given the divine strength to resist. Therefore, if you confessed, you must be guilty. It was a perfect closed loop of logic, from which there was no escape. After the interrogation, whether you confessed or not, you would be thrown back into your cell, a broken, bleeding mess. You would be left to lie in the filth with your dislocated shoulders, crushed fingers, and seared skin, with no medical attention whatsoever. You were simply left to fester, to recover just enough so that they could begin the process all over again if they wished. Your mind, under this relentless pressure, would start to retreat. It would build walls to protect itself. One of the most common coping mechanisms was apathy. You would simply stop caring. The filth, the hunger, the pain, it all became a dull, monotonous background noise. You would detach from your own suffering, observing it as if it were happening to someone else. This emotional numbness was a shield, protecting the fragile core of your sanity from being shattered. You would cease to hope for release, and cease to fear the next day's torments. You would simply exist, moment to moment, a ghost in a machine of misery. This was not a sign of strength. It was a symptom of a spirit that was slowly being crushed into nothingness. You were winning the battle for survival by losing the very things that made you human. Memory would start to play tricks on you. In the darkness, your mind would wander back to your former life. You would recall the face of your spouse, the taste of a favorite meal, the feeling of the sun on your skin. At first, these memories would be a comfort, a private sanctuary you could escape to. But over time, they would become a source of exquisite pain. The contrast between the warmth of your memories and the cold, hard reality of your cell was a torture of its own. Eventually, your brain might start to dim these memories to protect you, blurring the faces and dulling the sensations. The beautiful world you once knew would fade, leaving you with only the grim reality of the dungeon. This was another way the oubliette worked. It didn't just make the world forget you, it made you forget the world. The sheer monotony was a weapon. Every day was exactly the same as the last. The darkness, the drip of water, the scuttling of rats, the meager meal slid through the door. There was no novelty, no change, no distraction. This endless, grinding repetition was designed to break the human spirit, which craves variety and purpose. You might try to create a routine to fight it. You could count the drips of water. You could try to do exercises in your cramped space. You could trace patterns on the slimy wall with your finger. These small acts of defiance, of imposing order on the chaos, were desperate attempts to hold on to your sanity. But the dungeon was patient. It could outlast your routines. Eventually, the crushing sameness would wear you down, until all you could do was sit and wait. Let's consider the concept of justice itself. Your trial, if it ever came, would not resemble a modern court proceeding. There would likely be no jury of your peers, no lawyer to defend you. You would be brought before a magistrate or a lord, who would act as both judge and prosecutor. The evidence against you might be flimsy, the testimony of a rival, a rumor, or simply the fact that you were unpopular. Your confession, likely extracted under torture, would be the primary piece of evidence. The verdict was often a foregone conclusion. The trial was not a process of discovering the truth. It was a public ritual designed to reinforce the power of the authorities and make an example of you. Your guilt or innocence was often secondary to the needs of the state. And the sentence? If you were found guilty of a serious crime, it would not be more prison time. Long-term incarceration was expensive, and generally not the point. The punishments were designed to be public, brutal, and memorable. You could be sentenced to the stocks, where you would be publicly humiliated and pelted with refuse. You could be branded with a hot iron, marking you as a criminal for life. For more serious offenses, the sentence was death, carried out in a variety of gruesome ways: hanging, beheading, or even being burned at the stake. In a grim irony, after months or years of suffering in the darkness of the dungeon, your final moments would be a public spectacle, a piece of theater for the masses. Your quiet, private suffering would end with a loud, public, and violent death. But let's step back into the cell for a moment and examine the air itself. It was not just cold and damp. It was foul. The air in a dungeon was stagnant, with very little circulation. It became saturated with the smell of human waste, unwashed bodies, rot, and disease. This was called jail fever, which we now know as typhus. It was a disease spread by the body lice that infested every prisoner's clothes and bedding. The symptoms were a high fever, a splitting headache, a dark rash, and delirium. Jail fever was incredibly contagious and deadly. It would sweep through a crowded dungeon, killing prisoners and guards alike. The very air you breathed was thick with pestilence. Each inhalation was a gamble, a roll of the dice, with a disease that could kill you in a matter of days, a far quicker end than starvation. Your relationship with your own body would become deeply estranged. You would cease to see it as a source of strength or pleasure. It was now a source of constant betrayal. Your stomach would cramp with hunger. Your joints would ache with cold. Your skin would itch and burn from bites and rashes. You would be acutely aware of every unpleasant gurgle, every painful twinge. This hyper-focus on your own physical misery was all-consuming. It was difficult to think, to remember, to hope, when every signal your body sent to your brain was one of pain and distress. The dungeon masterfully turned your own physiology into an instrument of your confinement. You were imprisoned not just by 4 stone walls, but by the failing, agonizing prison of your own skin. This created a profound sense of alienation from yourself. Religion and faith would play a complex role in your survival. For some, their belief in God would be a profound source of comfort. They could pray, finding solace in the idea that their suffering had a purpose, that it was a test of their faith, and that a reward awaited them in the afterlife. This internal narrative could provide a powerful shield against the despair of the dungeon. It gave meaning to the meaningless. But for others, the experience would shatter their faith. How could a benevolent God allow such a place to exist? How could he ignore their desperate prayers? For these prisoners, the silence from the heavens was more deafening than the silence of the guards. The loss of faith in the dungeon was a catastrophic event, removing the last pillar of hope and leaving them truly existentially alone in the darkness. Let's consider the social structure of a larger, more populated dungeon, where multiple prisoners might be kept together in a single large cell. This was not a band of brothers. It was a brutal, Darwinian society in miniature. The strongest and most ruthless prisoners would dominate. They would steal food from the weaker ones. They would claim the best spots on the floor. The places that were slightly drier or further from the waste bucket. A rigid, violent hierarchy would form quickly. New prisoners would be tested, beaten, and forced to submit. Alliances would be temporary and treacherous. In this environment, your fellow man was not a source of comfort, but your most immediate and dangerous threat. The guards encouraged this infighting as it kept the prisoners weak, divided, and unable to organize any form of resistance. In this communal hell, sleep would be even more dangerous. You would have to sleep with one eye open, constantly worried that someone would steal your meager ration of bread, or, worse, try to kill you for your clothes, or simply out of madness. Any sign of weakness, a cough, a limp, would make you a target. You would have to project an aura of strength and vigilance at all times, which was incredibly exhausting. The mental strain of constantly navigating this dangerous social landscape was immense. The loneliness of a single cell was terrifying, but the constant, violent threat posed by other desperate men in a shared cell was a different and perhaps even more stressful form of horror. You were never safe, never able to let your guard down for a single moment, awake or asleep. Let's explore the idea of light. For most prisoners, there was none, but some dungeons had a single tiny slit of a window set high up in the wall near the ceiling. This was not a window you could look out of. It was just a sliver of the outside world, an opening that let in a single, dusty shaft of light for a few hours a day. This beam of light would become the absolute center of your universe. You would watch it appear on the far wall, a pale, ghostly rectangle. You would watch it creep slowly across the stone as the sun moved across the sky. It was your clock, your calendar, and your only connection to the living world. You would follow its path with a religious intensity, and when it finally faded and disappeared, the darkness that returned would feel 100 times more profound and complete. This sliver of light was a cruel gift. It gave you a glimpse of what you had lost, reminding you that just outside these walls, the world continued on with its warmth and its beauty. It could fuel your hope for release, a hope that was likely to be crushed. Some prisoners might come to hate the light. They might prefer the steady, predictable oblivion of total darkness to this daily reminder of their confinement. The light represented a world they could no longer access, a life they would likely never live again. It was a symbol of freedom that served only to highlight the thickness of the walls and the permanence of the bars. It was a beautiful, painful, and maddening thing, a daily visitation from a god who would show you paradise but never let you enter. The legal status of a prisoner was often ambiguous. You were not a citizen with rights. You were essentially the property of the lord or king who had imprisoned you. He could keep you here for the rest of your life without a trial if he so wished. He could have you tortured. He could have you executed. Your life was entirely in his hands, subject to his whims and moods. This absolute lack of agency was a core part of the experience. You had no power, no control over any aspect of your existence, from when you ate to whether you lived or died. This complete powerlessness was profoundly dehumanizing. It was a systematic dismantling of your will, designed to make you compliant and to break your spirit long before your body gave out. Let us also consider the sounds from the world above. Dungeons were often located directly beneath the great hall of a castle. While you shivered in the dark, you might hear the faint sounds of a feast drifting down from above. The distant echo of music, the muffled roar of laughter, the clatter of plates. You would lie there, starving in the filth, while directly over your head, people were celebrating, warm and well-fed. You could smell the faint aroma of roasting meat filtering through the cracks in the ceiling. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate architectural choice. The proximity of the Lord's pleasure to the prisoner's pain was a powerful statement of social order and power. It was a way of saying, "This is my world of joy and plenty, and this is your world of darkness and suffering, and the only thing separating them is my will." The end of your time in the dungeon might not come from a trial or an execution. For many, the end was quiet and anonymous. You would simply succumb to the cumulative effects of malnutrition, disease, and despair. Your body would finally give out. Your breathing would grow shallow, and your heart would slow. Your last moments would be spent lying on the cold, filthy floor, alone in the absolute darkness. There would be no one to hold your hand, no one to hear your last words. Your death would go unnoticed for a day or two, until the guard came with your food and realized you were no longer eating it. There would be no ceremony, no burial. Your body would be dragged out and disposed of in the most convenient way possible, likely dumped in an unmarked pit with the other forgotten prisoners. Let's dive deeper into the specific architecture of fear. Not all cells were simple squares. Some were designed with a cruel ingenuity to maximize discomfort. For instance, there were strathegis, or little eases. These were cells that were deliberately too small. They might be too low to stand up in, forcing you into a permanent, painful crouch. Or they might be too narrow to lie down in, forcing you to remain standing or sitting upright for days on end. The constant strain on your muscles would be agonizing, leading to severe cramps and long-term damage. This was a form of torture that required no active participation from the guards. The room itself did all the work. It was a relentless, passive application of pain, a testament to the creativity that humans can apply to the suffering of others. The simple geometry of your cell became your tormentor. Another architectural horror was the drowning pit, or water pit. This was a cell that was intentionally built below the water table or connected to a castle's moat or a nearby river. At high tide, or during heavy rains, the cell would slowly begin to fill with cold, filthy water. The prisoner would be forced to stand, treading water or clinging to ledges, as the water level rose around them. It might rise to their knees, their waist, or even their necks. This was not designed to drown them outright, but to keep them in a perpetual state of near drowning, of panic, and of agonizing cold. They would be soaked to the skin, shivering uncontrollably, for hours or days, until the water receded, only for the cycle to begin again. It was a terrifying, Sisyphean torment that combined the fear of drowning with the slow agony of hypothermia. The psychological effect of being in one of these water pits would be devastating. You would live in constant fear of the water's return. The sound of rain outside, or the lapping of waves, would trigger a profound sense of dread. The water itself would be teeming with sewage, leeches, and other foul things. You would be forced to stand in this cold, disgusting soup, unable to rest, unable to sleep. The constant dampness would cause your skin to break down, leading to painful sores and infections. It was a multi-sensory assault designed to break even the strongest will. You were not just confined, you were submerged in a world of filth and fear, your survival dependent on the whims of the tide, a force of nature co-opted into a mechanism of torture. It was a near-perfect system for destroying a human being, both physically and mentally. Your sense of identity would begin to dissolve entirely. Stripped of your name, your clothes, your possessions, and your health, what was left? You might even forget what you looked like. With no mirror and no one to see you, your own face would become a mystery, a distant memory. You were defined only by your suffering. You were a collection of aches, itches, and fears. The person you were before the dungeon would seem like a character from a story, completely disconnected from the creature you had become. This loss of self is the ultimate goal of the dungeon. It sought to unmake you so completely that even if you were to be released, the person who walked out would bear little resemblance to the person who walked in. The dungeon aimed to kill your soul long before it killed your body. Could there be any human connection in this place? Perhaps. In the darkness, you might develop a strange relationship with the jailer. He was your tormentor, but he was also your only link to the human race. You would learn to interpret the sound of his footsteps, the way he slid the bolt on the door. You might try to engage him in conversation, a desperate plea for a moment of human interaction. Most of the time, you would be met with silence or a curse. But very rarely, a guard might show a flicker of pity, perhaps speaking a single word to you or leaving a slightly larger piece of bread. These tiny, insignificant moments of grace would become monumental events, replayed in your mind for days, a desperate anchor to the idea that not all humanity was lost. There was also the possibility of a connection with the rats. As terrifying as they were also a form of life. A prisoner, starved for any kind of interaction, might begin to observe them, to learn their habits, to give them names. One might even try to tame a rat, leaving a few crumbs of their precious bread as an offering. This relationship, born of profound loneliness, would be a fragile and dangerous one. The rat was not a pet. It was a wild, disease-carrying animal. But in the depths of solitary confinement, the need for connection is so powerful that a person might seek it in the most unlikely and perilous of companions, simply to have another living thing to share the darkness with. It was a testament to the resilience of the human need for community, even in the most inhuman of places. Let's consider the scenario where you are not alone, but imprisoned with a single cellmate. This could be a blessing or a curse. A good cellmate could be a lifeline. You could talk to each other, keeping your minds sharp and staving off madness. You could watch over each other while you slept, protecting one another from the rats. You could share stories, comfort each other, and maintain a shared sense of hope and humanity. In the darkness, the simple presence of another person, another voice, could be the difference between survival and a complete mental collapse. Your shared suffering could forge a bond stronger than any friendship forged in the outside world. It would be a partnership forged in the deepest pit of hell. However, the wrong cellmate could make the dungeon infinitely worse. You could be locked in a tiny, dark space with a person who is violent, insane, or hopelessly ill. They might try to steal your food, harm you in your sleep, or simply drive you mad with their constant screaming or weeping. You would be trapped in an intimate proximity with your worst enemy, with absolutely no escape. Every moment would be filled with tension and fear. The guards would be indifferent to your plight. To them, you were just two bodies in a box. This forced intimacy with a dangerous or broken individual was a refined form of psychological torture, turning the basic human need for companionship into a constant, terrifying threat. You would pray for the solitude you once dreaded. Finally, let's think about the possibility of release. It was rare, but it happened. Perhaps your family paid a massive ransom, or a new king came to power and pardoned all prisoners, or your accuser died and the case against you was dropped. One day, without warning, the guards would come. They would unlock your door and drag you out of the cell. The first shock would be the light. After months or years in darkness, even the dim torchlight of the corridor would be blindingly painful. Your eyes, accustomed to the void, would be seared with an agony you could not have imagined. You would be physically weak, your muscles atrophied, barely able to stand. You would be a gaunt, skeletal figure, covered in filth and sores, blinking away tears of pain in a world that was suddenly too bright. As they led you up the stairs and out into the open air, the world would rush in with a bewildering intensity. The warmth of the sun on your skin, the feeling of a breeze, the riot of colors, the symphony of sounds. It would be a total sensory overload. Your brain, which had adapted to a world of near-zero stimulus, would be unable to process it all. The experience would be disorienting, terrifying, and overwhelming. You might be free from the dungeon's walls, but the dungeon would not be free of you. The darkness, the cold, and the fear would be imprinted on your mind forever. You would carry the memory of the filth and the rats with you for the rest of your life. You have survived, but you have not escaped. The person who walked out into the sunlight was not the same one who was thrown down those stairs so long ago. You are free, but your body does not know it yet. It remains a prisoner of its long ordeal. Every joint screams with the pain of arthritis born from the damp. Your muscles, having wasted away, refuse to support you properly, and you tremble like a newborn foal with every step. Food is a new kind of torture. Your shrunken stomach rebels against anything more than a few bites, and the richness of normal food is a shock that can make you violently ill. You have dreamed of a hot meal for years, but now that it is in front of you, you cannot eat it. People speak to you, but their voices are a confusing cacophony. You find you have forgotten how to hold a normal conversation, your own voice a rough, unused croak. You are a ghost at the feast of life, present in body but trapped in the memory of starvation and silence. The world itself now feels alien and threatening. After existing in a space that was only a few feet square, the vastness of an open field or a wide street can trigger a profound sense of anxiety, a fear of open spaces. Your mind, accustomed to the comforting press of stone walls, panics in the immensity of the world. Conversely, a crowd of people feels like a suffocating wave of bodies, their smells and noises, an unbearable assault on your oversensitized perceptions. You find yourself seeking out small, dark, quiet places, subconsciously recreating the conditions of your confinement because, as horrific as it was, it became your reality. The world you fought so hard to return to is now a source of terror. The dungeon has warped your very instincts, turning the concept of safety inside out. You are a creature of the dark, ill-equipped for the light. The way people look at you is a new form of imprisonment. They do not see the person you once were. They see a walking skeleton with sunken eyes, sallow skin, and the patchy, unhealthy hair of the malnourished. Your clothes, likely given to you as charity, hang loosely on your emaciated frame. People stare, whisper, and pull their children away. They are not just repulsed by your appearance, they are afraid of you. They fear you carry jail fever or some other pestilence from the prison. You are marked, tainted by your experience. This social isolation is a different kind of cell, one with invisible walls. You have been returned to the world of the living, but you are treated like a specter, a grim reminder of a place that polite society prefers to forget exists. Returning to your home, if you are lucky enough to still have one, is a heartbreaking experience. The place you have held in your memory as a perfect, warm sanctuary has changed. Perhaps your spouse, believing you dead, has remarried. Perhaps your children, who were small when you were taken, are now grown and look at you as a stranger. The world did not stop and wait for you. Life went on. The rhythms of your family and your village have reformed in your absence, and there is no longer a space for you to fit into. You are a relic from a past they have all moved on from. The crushing realization dawns on you that you cannot go back. You have not been returned to your old life. You have been born into a new, unfamiliar one where you are an outsider in your own home. Sleep, which was once a fitful escape, now becomes impossible. A soft bed feels alien and wrong. Your body, accustomed for years to the unyielding hardness of a stone floor, cannot relax into the plushness of a mattress. The profound quiet of a country night is unnerving. You lie awake, straining your ears for the familiar rhythmic drip of water or the scratching of rats in the walls, sounds that had become the lullaby of your long confinement. You might find yourself getting out of bed to lie on the hard wooden floor, the familiar discomfort, a strange and twisted form of security. You are haunted by the silence. The dungeon has rewired your brain so completely that the basic comforts of a normal life have become sources of anxiety and restlessness. Rest, true rest, is a country you may never be able to visit again. The dungeon has left its permanent signature on your flesh. The chronic cough you develop from the damp air never truly goes away, a rattling reminder in your chest. Your joints swell and ache with every change in the weather, a painful barometer of your time in the cold. Your teeth, loosened by scurvy, may never be strong again, making eating a difficult and painful chore. You are prone to sickness, your body's defenses shattered by years of malnutrition and stress. You are alive, but you are not whole. You live in a state of chronic pain and weakness, a daily testament to the dungeon's enduring power. It is a slow-acting poison that continues to work on you long after you have been freed from the cell. You have won the battle for survival, but you have lost the war for your own health. The mental scars are even deeper than the physical ones. You live with a constant humming anxiety, a feeling that disaster is always just around the corner. You might hoard scraps of food, hiding them away in pockets or under your bed, unable to shake the deep-seated fear of starvation. A sudden loud noise can send you into a state of panic. Being in a dark room, even for a moment, can trigger a suffocating wave of terror, transporting you back to the absolute blackness of the cell. You are suspicious of everyone, especially those in authority. Trust is a concept that has been burned out of you. You are living with a wound in your mind that will not close, a ghost that whispers to you in the quiet moments, reminding you that safety is an illusion and that the darkness can return at any time. Trying to rejoin the economic life of your community is a monumental challenge. If you were a farmer, you may no longer have the physical strength to work the fields. If you were a craftsman, your hands, damaged by cold and arthritis, may no longer have the dexterity for fine work. And even if you are able, who will hire you? The stigma of being a former prisoner is a heavy burden. People assume you are a criminal, that you are untrustworthy. Your time in the dungeon has not just cost you your health, it has cost you your reputation and your livelihood. You are an outcast, unable to provide for yourself or your family, a burden on a community that is already suspicious of you. The dungeon has not just taken your past, it has stolen your future. This struggle culminates in a profound loss of identity. You are no longer the person you were. You are not the farmer, the father, the husband. The title that fits you best now is survivor, but that is not a role that society understands or values. You feel disconnected from yourself, a stranger in your own skin. You have seen a side of humanity and of yourself that you cannot unsee. You have been stripped down to your most basic animalistic core, and you are not sure how to rebuild a person from those grim foundations. You exist in a liminal space, no longer a prisoner, but not truly a free man either. You are a man defined not by what you are, but by what you have endured and what you have lost. The dungeon's ghost follows you everywhere. A musty smell in a cellar, the sight of a rat scurrying across a path, the feeling of a cold stone wall. Any of these can trigger a vivid sensory flashback. For a terrifying moment, you are back there. You can feel the slime, smell the decay, hear the moans. The world around you dissolves, replaced by the memory of the cell. These episodes are unpredictable and debilitating, a constant reminder that although you have left the physical place, the psychological prison is something you will carry with you for the rest of your life. You have escaped the stone walls, but you are still trapped within the walls of your own memory, a prisoner of your own past, doing a life sentence in your mind. But not every person who was thrown down those stone steps was a common thief or a vagrant accused of a petty crime. The dungeon was an equal opportunity destroyer of lives, and it held a special kind of horror for those who had once known power and privilege. For a nobleman, a knight, or a wealthy merchant, the fall into that darkness was not just a physical one. It was a fall from the very pinnacle of society into its deepest, darkest pit. The shock of this transition, the sheer distance of the fall, created a psychological torment that was unique to them. Their story of survival, or more often, their failure to survive, adds another layer to our understanding of this terrible place. On paper, a high-status prisoner might have it better. If their family had enough money and influence, they could bribe the jailer for a private cell, one that might be higher up, with a window and perhaps even a fireplace. They might be allowed their own bedding, books to read, and better food sent in from outside kitchens. This was the reality of imprisonment in places like the Tower of London. But these comforts were a gilded cage. They did little to alleviate the core miseries of imprisonment: the isolation, the uncertainty, and the constant, gnawing fear. In some ways, these small comforts made it worse, a constant reminder of the luxurious life they had lost and might never regain. The fall from a feather bed to a straw pallet is a much harder landing than from a dirt floor. Let's imagine the world of this noble prisoner. He is locked in a small stone chamber. He has a book, but his mind is too consumed with anxiety to focus on the words. He has a decent meal, but he eats it alone, the silence of the room amplifying the sound of his own chewing. He looks out his small, barred window, not at a beautiful landscape, but at a dreary castle courtyard, watching the guards go about their daily routines, each one a symbol of his own powerlessness. He is not suffering from the filth and starvation of the common prisoner, but he is suffering from a profound and total loss of agency. His entire life has been defined by giving orders, by making decisions, by being in control. Now, he is utterly helpless, his fate decided by the political whims of his rivals. The psychological toll of this was immense. A common man might dream of returning to his simple life. A nobleman dreamed of returning to a world of power, wealth, and influence that was almost certainly lost to him forever. His lands would be confiscated, his titles stripped, his family name disgraced. Everything he had built, everything his ancestors had built, was being dismantled while he sat and watched from a stone room. This sense of catastrophic failure, of having let down his entire lineage, was a burden that could crush a man's spirit more effectively than any physical torture. He was not just losing his life, he was losing his legacy, his very reason for being. The dungeon didn't just take his freedom, it erased his mark on the world. For a noble prisoner, especially one accused of treason, imprisonment was almost always just a waiting room for the executioner. They were not forgotten in an oubliette. They were a political statement waiting to be made. Every day, they would wake with the dreadful anticipation that this would be the day. They would listen for the sound of heavy footsteps approaching their door, the sound that signaled the end. This constant, high-stakes waiting game was a unique form of mental torture. They lived on a knife's edge, suspended between a life of immense privilege and a brutal public death. Their final walk would be from their relatively comfortable cell to the executioner's block, a short journey that represented the complete and final collapse of their world. Now, let's consider the specific horrors faced by a female prisoner. In a world and a system dominated by brutal men, a woman in a dungeon was in a position of almost unimaginable vulnerability. The physical hardships of cold, hunger, and disease were the same for everyone, but women faced an additional layer of constant, terrifying threat. There was no concept of a separate women's prison. She would be housed in the same environment as male prisoners and guarded exclusively by men. Her safety, her dignity, and her very life were entirely at the mercy of her jailers, men who operated with total impunity in a world without witnesses. The dungeon was a place without law, and for a woman, that lawlessness was a direct and personal threat. The simple act of daily survival was fraught with peril. A woman's privacy was non-existent. She was subject to the constant gaze and commentary of guards. The most basic human needs became exercises in humiliation and fear. Any request for a small comfort or any complaint about her treatment could be met with violence or a worse kind of attention. The threat of sexual assault was a constant, unspoken reality, a weapon of terror and control that could be used by any guard at any time. For women accused of crimes like adultery or witchcraft, this vulnerability was often seen as part of their punishment. They were considered fallen women, and in the eyes of their captors, they deserved whatever horrors befell them in the darkness of the cell. Think of a figure like Anne Boleyn, a queen of England, who went from the throne to a cell in the Tower of London in a matter of weeks. She was held in relatively comfortable apartments, but she was a prisoner nonetheless. She knew her fate was sealed. In her final days, she was surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, who were, in reality, spies reporting her every word back to her enemies. She was trapped in a web of political intrigue, her life a pawn in a game she had already lost. Her executioner was famously brought over from France because he was more skilled with a sword, a final, small mercy in a story devoid of it. Her experience demonstrates that even for the most powerful woman in the land, the dungeon, in whatever form it took, was the ultimate leveler, a place where status and power dissolved into pure, concentrated fear. But not all prisoners were accused of great crimes like treason or murder. One of the most common reasons for being locked away was far more mundane: debt. Debtors' prisons were a common feature of the medieval and early modern landscape. If you owed someone money and could not pay, your creditor could have you thrown in prison. You were not being punished for a crime in the traditional sense. You were being held as collateral. The logic was simple. Your confinement would pressure your friends and family to scrape together the money to pay your debt and secure your release. It was a system that turned human freedom into a commodity, a tool for debt collection. The cruel and inescapable logic of the debtor's prison was its most terrifying feature. You were imprisoned because you couldn't pay your debt. But because you were imprisoned, you could not work to earn the money to pay your debt. You were trapped in a perfect, logical circle of misery. Your only hope was outside help. If your family was poor, or if your debt was too large, you could remain in that prison for years, or even for the rest of your life. It was a system that criminalized poverty and misfortune, creating a permanent underclass of people who were trapped not by a sentence from a judge, but by a number on a ledger. The prison gates were locked not by iron keys, but by coins. Conditions in these debtors' prisons were often even worse than in criminal dungeons. Many were run as private, for-profit enterprises. The jailer, or keeper, made his money by charging the inmates for everything. You had to pay for your food, your water, your bedding, even for the very space you occupied. If you had money, you could live on the master's side, in a private room with some comforts. If you were penniless, you were thrown onto the common side, a series of large, squalid, overcrowded rooms where sickness and starvation were rampant. In a grim irony, the very people who were imprisoned for having no money were the ones who were left to rot and die, because they couldn't afford the fees to stay alive inside the prison. Even men of the cloth were not immune to the dungeon. A priest, a monk, or a bishop who fell afoul of the king or the pope could find himself in a cell just like any other man. For these prisoners, the ordeal was not just physical and mental, it was profoundly spiritual. Their entire lives were built on a framework of divine order, prayer, and ritual. The dungeon was the antithesis of this, a chaotic, godless place defined by suffering and decay. For a clergyman, this environment would pose a deep crisis of faith. How could God allow his servant to be subjected to such misery? Was this a test, like the trials of Job, or was it a sign that he had been abandoned by heaven? The silence of the cell became a reflection of the silence of his God. The charges against a clergyman could range from political intrigue to financial corruption, but the most serious charge of all was heresy. A heretic was not just a criminal, he was a threat to the very fabric of society and the salvation of all souls. The interrogation of a heretic was a specialized affair. It would be conducted not by guards, but by learned theologians and inquisitors. The goal was not just a confession of guilt, but a complete recantation of their supposedly false beliefs. The torture applied would be justified as a necessary evil, a painful surgery to save a corrupted soul from eternal damnation. The prisoner's body would be broken in the service of saving his soul, a brutal expression of spiritual certainty. Now, let's consider the prisoner of war. After a battle, the victorious army would be left with hundreds or even thousands of captured enemy soldiers. Their fate was entirely dependent on their social status. They were not criminals in the traditional sense, but they were a problem to be managed. For a captured nobleman or a wealthy knight, their value was in their ransom. They were a walking treasure chest, a source of potential income for their captor. They would be treated relatively well, kept under guard but given decent food and lodging, to ensure they remained healthy until their family could pay the price for their return. It was a brutal but well-understood business transaction. For the common foot soldier, however, the story was very different. A peasant archer or a simple spearman had no ransom value. He was a liability. He was another mouth to feed, another body to guard. His fate was often grim. He and his comrades might be stripped of their armor and weapons and simply left to starve in a makeshift prison camp. Or, if they were considered too much trouble, they might be massacred outright, a quick and efficient way to solve the logistical problem they represented. For the common soldier, being captured was often a worse fate than being killed on the battlefield. It was a slow and anonymous death from disease or starvation, far from home and completely without honor. The ransom system for nobles was a complex and stressful affair. The captured lord would be allowed to write letters to his family, explaining his situation and pleading with them to raise the enormous sum required for his freedom. This process could take months or even years. The family on the outside would have to mortgage their lands, sell their heirlooms, and borrow heavily to meet the captor's demands. The prisoner, meanwhile, lived in a state of constant anxiety. His life depended entirely on his family's ability and willingness to pay. If they failed, he could be sold to another captor, or simply left to languish in prison indefinitely. His life was a line item on a balance sheet, his freedom a matter of cold, hard cash. It is a horrifying thought, but children were not exempt from the horrors of the dungeon. In a time with a less defined concept of childhood, young people were often treated as miniature adults by the legal system. A child caught stealing a loaf of bread could be thrown into the same cell as a hardened criminal. Sometimes, entire families would be imprisoned together for debt, and the children would be forced to endure the same squalid conditions as their parents. They would witness things that no child should ever see: violence, sickness, and death. Their experience of the dungeon would be one of pure, uncomprehending terror, a world of darkness and monsters from which there was no escape. The complete and utter vulnerability of a child in the dungeon cannot be overstated. They were physically weak, unable to defend themselves from older, stronger prisoners who might steal their food or subject them to terrible abuse. They were susceptible to the diseases that ran rampant in the filth, their small bodies having little resistance to infections that might sicken an adult. They were entirely at the mercy of the guards, who might see them as a nuisance, or, even worse, as a target. The chance of a child surviving a long-term stay in a medieval dungeon was slim. It was a machine designed to break strong men. For a child, it was an almost certain death sentence, a place where innocence was extinguished with brutal efficiency. The legal framework offered them no protection. The age of criminal responsibility was shockingly low. In some legal systems, a child as young as 7 could be tried and punished as an adult. They could be subjected to the same interrogations, the same punishments, and the same executions. The idea of a separate justice system for juveniles, one focused on reform rather than punishment, was a concept that was still centuries in the future. In the medieval world, if a child was old enough to commit a crime, they were considered old enough to face the full, terrifying consequences. The law saw a small criminal, not a small child, and it treated them accordingly with a chilling lack of compassion. These were the forgotten lives, the human stories that played out in the cold and the dark beneath the castles and cities. But the dungeon was not just a place, it was a system. And a system requires people to run it. What of the men who turned the keys, who slid the bowls of food across the floor, who listened to the moans and screams day after day? To truly understand the dungeon, we must also try to understand the world of the jailer. He was the master of this small, dark universe, the gatekeeper between the world of the living and the world of the forgotten. His role was crucial, complex, and deeply morally compromised. The jailer of our imagination is often a one-dimensional monster, a cackling villain who delights in the suffering of others. The reality was likely more complicated and, in some ways, more tragic. The average jailer was not a wealthy or powerful man. He was likely from the lower rungs of society, an ex-soldier or a man with few other prospects. It was a dirty, unpleasant, and low-status job. He was not necessarily a sadist. He was a man doing a job in a brutal world. He was likely underpaid, illiterate, and as much a victim of the system as the people he guarded. He was a cog in a machine, his own humanity, ground down by the daily routine of managing the misery of others. The daily life of a jailer was one of grim monotony and constant risk. He lived and worked in the same foul-smelling, unhealthy environment as his prisoners. He was exposed to the same deadly diseases. Jail fever killed jailers and their families just as easily as it killed the inmates. The job was also dangerous. Prisoners, driven by desperation, might try to attack him to escape. He had to be constantly vigilant, constantly projecting an aura of authority and intimidation to maintain control. His world was small, circumscribed by the prison walls. He was, in a very real sense, a prisoner himself, chained to his post by the need to earn a meager living. He was not free, he just had the keys to the cages. The entire system of imprisonment was built on a foundation of institutionalized corruption, and the jailer was its primary agent. His official salary was often very low. The bulk of his income was expected to come from fees extorted from the prisoners themselves. This was known as garnish. There was a fee for everything. A fee to have your shackles put on when you arrived, and a much larger fee to have them taken off if you were released. A fee for straw to sleep on, a fee for a blanket, a fee for a candle. Even the act of being released from prison was not free. You had to pay a liberation fee to the jailer before you were allowed to leave, even if you had been found innocent. It was a system designed to strip every last coin from the unfortunate. Living and working in this environment inevitably had a corrosive effect on a man's character. To survive, a jailer had to become desensitized to the human suffering that surrounded him. Empathy was a professional liability. If he started to feel pity for the prisoners, he would be unable to do his job effectively or to extort the fees that made up his living. Cruelty and indifference became necessary tools of the trade. A harsh word, a casual blow, a refusal of a plea for water. These were all part of the daily performance of power, ways of reminding the prisoners of their lowly status and his absolute control. Over time, the performance would become the reality. The job would hollow him out, leaving a man who saw his fellow human beings not as people, but as sources of income or problems to be managed. The prison had its own social hierarchy, a dark reflection of the feudal world outside. At the top was the constable, or the keeper, a man who often bought his position as an investment, hoping to make a profit from the fees and bribes he could collect. He rarely dirtied his own hands. Beneath him were the turnkeys, the day-to-day guards, who did the work of locking and unlocking doors, delivering food, and enforcing discipline. And at the very bottom were the unofficial helpers, sometimes prisoners themselves, who were given small privileges in exchange for acting as informants or bullies for the guards. It was a complex and brutal ecosystem, governed by its own unwritten rules of power, survival, and betrayal, all operating in the shadows cast by the world above. Let's take a closer look at the tools of the trade, the physical hardware of imprisonment. The chains and shackles were not just for preventing escape, they were instruments of punishment and control. They were heavy, cumbersome things, designed to inflict constant discomfort. Manacles for the wrists and fetters for the ankles would chafe the skin raw, leading to painful sores and infections. The sheer weight of the iron which a prisoner had to bear day and night would exhaust them and make any movement difficult. Sometimes a heavy iron ball would be attached to the leg irons, a constant, dragging reminder of their captivity. These were not just restraints, they were a permanent physical burden, a way of anchoring a prisoner's body to their misery. The use of these chains could be varied and cruel. A difficult prisoner might be chained to a ring in the wall in a contorted, painful position, unable to stand or lie down. They could be left like this for days, their muscles cramping and their joints screaming in protest. Two prisoners who fought might be chained together, forced into a hateful, intimate proximity from which there was no escape. The clanking sound of chains was the defining music of the dungeon, a constant metallic reminder of bondage and powerlessness. The act of putting on the chains was a ritual of degradation, and the dream of having them removed was the prisoner's most fervent and enduring hope. The dungeon was inextricably linked to what often came next, the public execution. The prison cell was the final waiting room, the green room for a gruesome piece of public theater. The shadow of the gallows, the headsman's block, where the executioner's pyre loomed over every moment of a condemned prisoner's existence. They would lie in their cell, listening to the sounds of the crowd gathering outside, hearing the hammering as the scaffold was constructed. Their private suffering was about to become a public spectacle. This transition, from the forgotten anonymity of the cell to the intense, focused gaze of a bloodthirsty crowd, was the final and most terrifying stage of their journey through the justice system. The executioner himself was a strange and feared figure in medieval society. His job was both necessary and abhorrent. He was a skilled professional, a specialist in the grim mechanics of death, but he was also a social outcast. People would avoid him in the street. He and his family were often forced to live on the outskirts of town, shunned by the very society that employed him. He was a man who lived with death every day, his hands stained by the work he did. When he came to the dungeon to collect the condemned, he was a figure of ultimate and terrifying authority, the man who would literally hold their life in his hands, the final character they would meet in their tragic story. The legacy of the medieval dungeon is so powerful that it has embedded itself deep within our language. Words like dungeon and oubliette still carry an immediate, visceral charge. We use them metaphorically to describe any place of darkness, confinement, or despair. The word jail, the older spelling of jail, has given us the disease jail fever. These words are more than just historical terms. They are cultural artifacts, shorthand for a specific and potent form of human-created horror. They are a testament to how deeply this institution has marked our collective imagination, a dark shadow that still lingers in the corners of our vocabulary, reminding us of a time when justice was a very different and much more terrifying concept. This brings us back to the stark contrast between the dungeon of our popular culture and the dungeon of reality. In stories and games, the dungeon is a place of adventure. It has secret passages, hidden treasures, and puzzles to be solved. It is a temporary obstacle on the hero's journey. The real medieval dungeon had no treasure. It had no adventure. Its only secret was the depth of human misery. It was a place defined not by excitement, but by a crushing, soul-destroying monotony. It was a bureaucratic institution of slow, grinding despair. The truth of the dungeon is not a thrilling story. It is a quiet, grim, and deeply sad one about filth, sickness, boredom, and the slow erasure of the human spirit. The very purpose of the dungeon was fundamentally different from our modern concept of a prison. Today we talk, at least in theory, about the idea of rehabilitation, of reforming criminals and preparing them to re-enter society. This concept would have been completely alien to the medieval mind. The dungeon was not about reform, it was about containment, punishment, and intimidation. It was a human warehouse where inconvenient people were stored, while the authorities decided what to do with them. And most of all, as we've seen with the oubliette, it was a place for forgetting. It was a tool to make people disappear, to remove them from the world so completely that it would be as if they had never existed at all. From a purely practical standpoint, the dungeon was an economic problem for the lord who owned the castle. Keeping prisoners, even in the most squalid conditions, cost money. Guards had to be paid, and some minimal amount of food had to be provided. This is why long-term imprisonment as a sentence was relatively rare. It was far cheaper and more efficient from the state's perspective to use other forms of punishment. Public humiliation in the stocks, a painful but non-fatal maiming like the removal of a hand, or a quick and final execution. These were all more cost-effective solutions. The dungeon was primarily a holding pen, a place of temporary storage before a more permanent and financially sensible solution could be administered. If, by some miracle, you were one of the lucky few to be released, your first moments of freedom would be defined by your senses. Let's think about the smell. After years of breathing the concentrated stench of decay, the first lungful of fresh air would be a shocking and beautiful thing. The simple scent of damp earth after a rain, of baking bread from a nearby shop, of wood smoke from a chimney, these ordinary smells would seem like the most exquisite perfumes. You would find yourself just standing and breathing, overwhelmed by the clean, complex, and wonderful scent of a world that was not actively rotting around you. It would be the smell of life itself, a resurrection for your senses. And the sounds, after the profound silence of the cell, broken only by drips, moans, and scratching, the soundscape of the outside world would be a symphony. The song of a bird, the laughter of children playing in the street, the distant lowing of a cow, the murmur of voices in a marketplace, these would all be new and miraculous. For so long, sound had been associated with fear and suffering. Now it was the sound of community, of nature, of life, continuing on. It would be overwhelming at first, perhaps even painful in its intensity, but it would also be a profound and joyful confirmation that you had truly returned to the world of the living, a world that was noisy and chaotic and beautiful. And finally, the feeling of freedom. The simple, profound joy of being able to walk in a straight line for more than a few feet. The feeling of the sun on your skin, a warmth that goes deeper than just the surface. A feeling you thought you might never experience again. The texture of clean, dry clothes against your body. The warmth of a fire on a cold evening. These are the small physical pleasures that free people take for granted every day. For the survivor of the dungeon, they would be moments of almost unbearable beauty and grace. A physical rebirth that would be just as powerful and just as overwhelming as their emotional one. Every simple comfort would feel like a miracle. But even amidst this sensory rebirth, the survivor might find themselves creating new prisons. The memory of confinement is a powerful architect. You might find you prefer small rooms to large ones. You might instinctively choose a chair in the corner of a tavern, your back to the wall, so you can see everyone who enters. You might eat your food too quickly, as if afraid someone will take it away. These are the unconscious habits of survival, behaviors learned in a place of constant threat that are difficult to unlearn in a place of relative safety. The physical dungeon is gone, but the psychological cage, the one you built in your own mind to survive, is much harder to dismantle. You are free, but you may never feel truly safe again. It is important to remember that the stories of those who survived are, by their very nature, the rare exception. For every one person who walked out of the dungeon and lived to tell the tale, there are countless others who did not. The vast majority of those who were thrown down into the darkness never came out. They died quietly and anonymously from disease, starvation, or violence. Their stories were never recorded. Their names are forgotten. The true history of the dungeon is written in these silences. It is a history of the disappeared, the erased, the unremembered. We focus on the survivors because we must, but the grim reality is that the dungeon was, above all else, a place of endings. Ultimately, the medieval dungeon serves as a powerful and disturbing metaphor. It is a physical manifestation of some of the darkest aspects of human nature. It represents our capacity for cruelty, our willingness to inflict suffering on others to maintain power or enforce order. It shows the ease with which we can dehumanize and forget those we deem as other or lesser. It is a monument to indifference, a structure built not just of stone and mortar, but of fear, greed, and the quiet, bureaucratic administration of misery. It is a dark mirror, reflecting a part of our collective history that is deeply uncomfortable to look at, but that we must never allow ourselves to forget. And so, your day in the medieval dungeon comes to a close. You have walked down the cold stone steps. You have sat in the absolute darkness. You have felt the hunger and the fear. You have endured the long, slow, grinding process of being unmade. And you have, against all odds, emerged blinking into the light. The journey is over. You can open your eyes and return to the comfort and safety of your own time. But perhaps a small piece of that cold stone, a faint echo of the dripping water, remains. It is the understanding that the romanticized castle on the hill always has a dark, forgotten basement, and that survival, then as now, was never, ever guaranteed. That image of the dungeon, the dark hole beneath the castle, is the most powerful one we have. But it's not the only story of imprisonment from that time. Confinement was a versatile tool, and it could be found in the highest places as well as the lowest. Let's imagine for a moment that you were not thrown down a flight of stairs but forced to climb them. Your prison is not a damp, dark cellar, but a single, isolated room at the very top of a tall stone tower. This might sound preferable. You have light, you have air. But this high-up prison had its own unique and refined set of psychological tortures, designed to break you in a different but no less effective way. In this tower room, your greatest enemy is not darkness, but exposure. You are at the mercy of the elements. The wind howls relentlessly around the stone, a constant, mournful sound that seeps through the cracks in the walls. In winter, The cold is sharp and biting, a wind chill that no small fireplace, if you are lucky enough to have one, can truly defeat. In summer, the sun beats down on the stone roof, turning your small room into an oven. Unlike the steady, subterranean chill of the dungeon, the tower prison subjects you to the violent extremes of the weather. You are pinned to the sky, a tiny, vulnerable speck in the face of the vast and indifferent forces of nature. The true torture of the tower room, however, is the view. Through your small, barred window, you can see the world. You can see for miles. You can watch the river winding its way to the sea. You can see the fields change color with the seasons. You can watch people, tiny as insects, going about their lives in the town below. You can see everything you have lost. This is not the sensory deprivation of the oubliette. It is sensory torment. Freedom is not an abstract memory. It is a constant, visible, and utterly unreachable reality laid out before you every single day. This constant visual reminder of your imprisonment could be a more maddening thing than any darkness. It is a daily, panoramic display of your own powerlessness. The isolation in a tower room is also a different flavor of lonely. In the dungeon, you could sometimes hear the distant moans of other prisoners, a grim reminder that you are not entirely alone in your suffering. In the tower, you are truly alone. The sounds of the world below are distant and faint, a ghostly echo of a life you cannot participate in. You are physically separated from humanity by hundreds of feet of empty air. This profound sense of being set apart, of floating above the world but being unable to touch it, creates a unique and terrible sense of alienation. You are a spectator to life, a ghost haunting the highest room of the castle, forgotten by the bustling world below. Escape from a tower seems, at first glance, more possible than from an underground cell. This simple, foolish hope could become its own form of torture. You might spend your days staring at the bars on your window, testing their strength. You might fantasize about making a rope from your bedding, a desperate plan that you see in stories. But the reality was grim. The drop was immense. The walls were sheer. The guards at the bottom were vigilant. The hope of escape was almost always a mirage, a cruel trick your mind played on you to pass the endless hours. The tower gave you the illusion of being closer to freedom, while in reality, you were just as securely caged as the man in the pit below. There was another form of confinement in the medieval world, one that is perhaps the most alien to our modern minds. It was a prison that was sometimes chosen voluntarily, a confinement undertaken not for punishment, but for piety. This was the world of the religious recluse, the anchorite or anchoress. These were men and women who, out of extreme religious devotion, chose to be permanently sealed inside a small room or cell, which was often attached to the side of a village church. This was not a sentence for a crime. It was seen as a holy and admirable life, a way of dedicating oneself entirely to God by withdrawing completely from the world. The ceremony for enclosing an anchoress was a somber and final one. It was essentially a funeral service. The woman would be led to her small stone cell, and the priest would read the rites for the dead over her. This was to symbolize that she was now dead to the world. Then, the entrance to her cell would be sealed up with stones and mortar, leaving only a small, slitted window through which food could be passed, and another small window, a squint, that looked into the church itself, so she could observe the Mass. Once the wall was sealed, it was not to be opened again until after her death. She had willingly entered her own tomb while still alive. Life inside this holy cell was one of extreme simplicity and hardship. The room was tiny, barely large enough to lie down in. It was cold, damp, and furnished with nothing more than a simple bed, a crucifix, and a prayer book. Her life was a rigid routine of prayer and contemplation, an endless cycle of devotion in a space that was both a sanctuary and a prison. While her choice was voluntary, the physical reality was no different from that of a prisoner. She suffered from the same cold, the same poor nutrition, the same isolation. Sickness was a constant threat, with no medical care available. It was a life of extreme physical deprivation, willingly endured for the promise of spiritual reward. The psychological pressure on an anchoress must have been immense. She was in a state of permanent, solitary confinement. While she might occasionally speak to villagers through her small window, offering them spiritual advice, she would never again have normal human contact. She would never walk in the sun or feel the rain. Did she ever regret her choice? Did she ever beat her fists against the cold stone walls, desperate for a freedom she had willingly given away? We can never know. But it is a powerful reminder that the idea of confinement, of separating a person from the world, was a central concept in the medieval mindset, used not only for punishment, but also for what was considered the highest form of spiritual expression. This leads us to the strange and terrifying logic of the medieval justice system itself, the very system that filled these dungeons and cells. It was a world that operated on a set of beliefs that are almost impossible for us to comprehend today. It was not based on evidence, investigation, or forensic science. It was based on the firm and unshakable belief that God would directly intervene in human affairs to reveal the truth. Justice was not something to be discovered by men. It was something to be revealed by God. This belief gave rise to one of the most bizarre legal practices in history, the trial by ordeal. Imagine you are accused of a crime. You plead your innocence, but there are no witnesses. In the medieval system, the court might decide to turn the matter over to God. You would be sentenced to a trial by ordeal. One common form was the ordeal of hot iron. A priest would bless a piece of iron and heat it in a fire until it was glowing red. You would then be required to carry this piece of iron for a set distance, perhaps 9 feet. After you dropped it, your hand would be bandaged and sealed by the priest. 3 days later, the bandages would be removed in a public ceremony. If your hand was healing cleanly, it was a sign from God that you were innocent. If it was festering and infected, it was a divine sign of your guilt. The sheer terror of this process is hard to overstate. You are being asked to willingly inflict a grievous injury upon yourself, with your life hanging in the balance. The outcome was not based on your guilt or innocence, but on the biology of a severe burn. In the unhygienic conditions of the time, a deep burn was almost certain to become infected. The system was therefore heavily weighted towards a verdict of guilty. Your only hope was that the priest might, for a bribe or out of pity, cool the iron slightly before you touched it, or that your body's natural healing ability was extraordinarily robust. You were placing your fate not in the hands of a jury, but in the hands of chance, superstition, and the mysterious workings of your own immune system. Another common method was the ordeal of cold water. Again, the water, usually a local river or pond, would be blessed by a priest. You would then be bound with ropes and thrown into it. The logic here was based on the belief that water, being a pure element blessed by God, would reject something evil. Therefore, if you floated, the water was rejecting you, and you were declared guilty. If you sank, the water was accepting you as pure, and you were declared innocent. Of course, the immediate problem was that if you sank, you would likely drown before they could pull you out. Your innocence would be proven, but you would be dead. It was a terrifying catch-22, a legal system that looked more like a cruel game of chance than a search for truth. These ordeals were not fringe practices. They were a fully accepted and mainstream part of the legal system for centuries. People were sent to the dungeon not after being found guilty, but while they were waiting for their ordeal to be administered. The dungeon was the holding pen for those about to have their fate decided by a hot piece of iron or a cold river. The system was eventually condemned by the Church in the early 13th century, not because it was cruel, but because theologians decided it was wrong to force God to perform a miracle on demand. But for hundreds of years, this was justice, a terrifying blend of faith, superstition, and state-sponsored violence. For the nobility, there was a different, and arguably more direct, form of divine justice: the trial by combat. If two knights or lords had a legal dispute, for instance over a piece of land or an accusation of treason, and there was no clear evidence, the court could order them to fight to the death. The belief was the same as in the ordeal: God would not allow the righteous man to be defeated. Therefore, the winner of the combat was, by definition, the one who was telling the truth. Justice was determined not by facts or arguments, but by strength, skill with a sword, and the sheer luck of battle. It was a system that turned a courtroom into a battlefield. The trial by combat was a highly ritualized affair. It would take place in a specially prepared field, or lists, surrounded by spectators. The two combatants, in full armor, would swear oaths on holy relics, calling on God to strike them down if they were lying. Then, at the signal from the king or the presiding lord, they would fight. The combat could be on horseback with lances, or on foot with swords, axes, or maces. It was not a sport. It was a brutal, deadly, serious legal proceeding. The fight would continue until one party was killed, or so badly wounded that he could no longer fight. This craven party was then declared guilty, and if he wasn't already dead, he would often be summarily executed. This system created a strange market for skilled fighters. A person who was not a trained warrior, such as a woman or an elderly man, could hire a, quote, champion to fight on their behalf. This meant that your life and your legal case depended on your ability to hire the best possible mercenary. Justice was not blind. It was for sale to the highest bidder, or to the person who could afford the strongest sword arm. This practice turned legal disputes into a kind of violent spectator sport, where the lives and fortunes of prominent families were decided by the bloody outcome of a single, public fight, all under the guise of divine will. These systems of justice help us understand the medieval mindset. The world was seen as a place where the supernatural constantly intervened in the natural. God was not a distant, abstract creator. He was an active participant in daily life, a divine judge who could be called upon to resolve a property dispute or identify a thief. The dungeon was the waiting room for this divine judgment. It was a place where you sat in the dark, contemplating the fact that your future would be decided not by men examining evidence, but by a bizarre and terrifying ritual designed to force the hand of God. The fear and uncertainty in that cell must have been of a different and more profound kind than even we can imagine. Let's ground these ideas in a specific, famous place. Perhaps no single building is more associated with the dark history of imprisonment than the Tower of London. But the Tower was never just a prison. That was only one of its many functions. It was, first and foremost, a fortress, a symbol of royal power, designed to dominate and intimidate the city of London. It was also a royal palace, a home for kings and queens. It housed the royal mint, where the kingdom's coins were made, and the royal menagerie, a zoo of exotic animals given as gifts to the monarch. The tower was a bustling, complex center of power. The prison was just one part of its machinery, the dark basement beneath the glittering palace. This dual nature is what made the tower so psychologically terrifying. It was a place of immense power and prestige, but also a place of utter helplessness. You could be a guest of the king at a feast in the Great Hall one week, and a prisoner in one of its cells the next. The line between favor and disgrace, between life and death, was incredibly thin. The prisoners held in the tower were often not common criminals, but high-status individuals who had fallen from grace, disgraced nobles, failed political rivals, and deposed queens. Their imprisonment was a public statement, a demonstration of the king's power to raise up and to cast down. The most famous and tragic story of the Tower is that of the princes in the Tower. After the death of King Edward IV, his two young sons, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, were lodged in the Tower, supposedly in preparation for the young king's coronation. But their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared the boys illegitimate and seized the throne for himself, becoming King Richard III. The two young princes were seen less and less, and then they disappeared entirely. It has been believed for centuries that they were murdered in their beds, on their uncle's orders, their bodies secretly buried somewhere within the tower's walls. Their story turned the tower into a place of mythic horror, a place where even innocent royal children were not safe. The confinement of a figure like Sir Walter Raleigh shows a different side of the tower's prison life. Raleigh, a famous explorer, courtier, and writer, spent more than a decade imprisoned in the tower under King James I, but his confinement was not in a filthy dungeon. He was held in a suite of rooms in the Bloody Tower. He was allowed to have his family live with him, to have servants, and to conduct scientific experiments in a small shed in the garden. He even wrote his famous History of the World during his long imprisonment. It was a comfortable, even scholarly confinement, but it was confinement nonetheless. He was a bird in a gilded cage, stripped of his freedom and living under a constant sentence of death. Raleigh's story illustrates the profound mental agony of long-term, uncertain imprisonment. He was eventually released to lead one last voyage to search for gold in the New World. When the voyage failed, he was brought back to England, and his old death sentence was reinstated. He spent his final night in the Tower, writing a last poem, before being taken out to be publicly beheaded. His long, comfortable imprisonment was ultimately just a drawn-out prelude to a violent end. The Tower of London was a patient predator. It could hold you in comfort for years, but in the end it almost always claimed its due. Its walls have absorbed more stories of political ambition, betrayal, and despair than perhaps any other building in England. Let us pivot from the grand political prisoners to the anonymous masses. Not all confinement was within the walls of a castle or a formal prison. For the poorest and most marginalized members of society, the entire world could feel like a kind of prison. Lepers, for example, were victims of a disease that was both terrifying and misunderstood. Believed to be highly contagious and a sign of divine punishment, lepers were systematically excluded from society. They were forced to live in special colonies, or leper houses, outside the town walls. They had to wear special clothing and ring a bell or a clapper to warn people of their approach. They were forbidden from touching healthy people or even speaking to them upwind. This was a form of social and physical imprisonment on a massive scale. A leper was effectively a walking dead person, legally and socially cut off from their former life. They lost their property, their family, and their place in the community. Their confinement was not in a cell of stone, but in a cell of fear and prejudice. They lived in a state of permanent quarantine, their world shrinking to the small, impoverished community of fellow sufferers. They were prisoners of their own bodies, sentenced by their disease to a life of slow, painful, and deeply lonely decay on the absolute margins of the human world. Theirs was a dungeon without walls, but one that was just as inescapable. Another form of hidden confinement was within the family itself. The concept of mental illness was not understood in the medieval period. People who suffered from severe depression, schizophrenia, or other mental disorders were often believed to be possessed by demons or to be changelings left by fairies. If their behavior became too disruptive or embarrassing for their family, they might be locked away. A wealthy family might confine a mentally ill relative to a remote room in their own castle or manor house. They would be kept out of sight, cared for by servants, but effectively imprisoned for life. They were the family's secret shame, a hidden skeleton in a literal closet. For a poor family, the options were much grimmer. They lacked the space or resources to care for a severely mentally ill relative. In these cases, the person might be abandoned, left to become a wandering madman or madwoman living on the fringes of society. Or they might be handed over to the authorities and thrown into the common dungeon with criminals, where their confusing and erratic behavior would make them easy targets for abuse. The dungeon was the default solution for anyone who did not fit neatly into the rigid social order, and the mentally ill were among the most vulnerable, confined not for any crime, but simply for the crime of being different in a world that had no framework to understand them. The legal system also had a special category of confinement for those who refused to cooperate. This was the peine forte et dure, or hard and forceful punishment. If a person accused of a serious crime refused to enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty, they could not be legally tried. To solve this problem, the court would order them to be pressed. The prisoner would be taken to a cell, stripped, and made to lie on the floor. A heavy wooden board would be placed on their chest. Then, heavy stones would be placed on the board, one by one, adding more and more weight. The goal was to force the prisoner to enter a plea. This was a brutal and agonizing form of torture. The weight would slowly crush the prisoner's body, making it impossible to breathe. They would be given only a few morsels of bread and a few sips of stagnant water each day to prolong the agony. This would continue, sometimes for days, until the prisoner either entered a plea or died from being crushed to death. Why would anyone choose this horrific fate? Because if they died without entering a plea, they had not been legally convicted of a crime. This meant that their property could not be confiscated by the state and could pass on to their family. It was a final, agonizing act of defiance, choosing a slow, crushing death to protect one's children's inheritance. All these different forms of confinement, from the oubliette to the tower, from the leper colony to the pressing room, paint a picture of a world where human life was cheap and suffering was an accepted tool of the state. The dungeon, in all its forms, was the ultimate expression of the power of the authorities over the individual. It was a place where your body, your mind, and your social identity could be systematically dismantled. It was the dark heart of the medieval legal and social system, a place of profound and carefully administered despair, where the light of the outside world was a distant and unattainable memory. Let's consider the tools and technology that made the dungeon possible. The medieval locksmith was a master of his craft, but his art was not just about creating security for the home. It was also about creating insecurity for the prisoner. The locks on dungeon doors were massive, complex things made of heavy iron. They were designed not just to be difficult to pick, but to be psychologically intimidating. The sound of the huge, heavy key turning in the lock, the loud clank of the bolts sliding home, these were sounds of finality. They were an audible statement of the prisoner's complete and total loss of freedom, a sonic seal on their new reality. The lock was not just a piece of hardware, it was a symbol of the state's inescapable power. The very architecture of the dungeon was a science of despair. The walls were incredibly thick, often many feet of solid stone, designed to muffle sound and prevent any hope of digging through. The doors were made of thick oak planks, reinforced with iron bands and huge nails, making them impossible to break down. The floors were often the bare earth or the bedrock on which the castle was built, cold, damp, and unforgiving. The whole structure was a carefully engineered environment, designed to maximize misery and minimize hope. It was a machine built of stone, its sole purpose the slow and steady crushing of the human spirit. Every architectural choice was a weapon. Even the location of the dungeon within the castle was a strategic choice. Placing it deep underground served several purposes. It ensured there was no natural light and very little fresh air. The constant temperature was cold and damp, which was physically debilitating. The isolation from the sounds of the outside world was psychologically disorienting. And, perhaps most importantly, it kept the prisoners out of sight and out of mind. The suffering that took place in the dungeon was hidden, invisible to the life of the castle above. This physical separation allowed the people in power to distance themselves from the brutal reality of the system they enforced. The dungeon's depth was a physical manifestation of its social and moral distance from the everyday world. Let's think about the food again, but from a different angle. The provision of food to prisoners was often a business. A local baker might have a contract to supply the prison with bread. To maximize his profit, he would use the cheapest, lowest quality flour and bulk it out with fillers like sawdust, chalk, or dried bean husks. This was not just about saving money. It was a reflection of the belief that prisoners did not deserve good food. The foul, gritty bread was a part of the punishment. It was a constant, edible reminder to the prisoner of their lowly, degraded status. Every meal was an act of humiliation, a way of reinforcing the idea that they were less than human and not worthy of even the most basic sustenance. The concept of sanctuary offers a fascinating contrast to the dungeon. In the medieval period, a person accused of a crime could flee to a church and claim sanctuary. Once inside the holy building, they were legally protected from arrest. The authorities had to wait outside. This was a powerful and deeply respected tradition. The church was God's house, a place where earthly law had no jurisdiction. For the fugitive, the church was a haven, a place of light, peace, and safety, the absolute opposite of the dungeon's darkness and terror. It was a temporary reprieve, a bubble of divine protection in a harsh and unforgiving legal world. However, sanctuary was not a permanent solution. The fugitive could not stay in the church forever. They were given a choice. After a certain period, usually around 40 days, they had to either surrender and face trial, or they could agree to abjure the realm. This meant they would confess their crime and agree to be exiled from the kingdom forever. If they chose exile, they would be escorted, often dressed only in a simple tunic and carrying a wooden cross, to the nearest seaport. From there, they had to take the first available ship out of the country. If they ever returned, they could be killed on sight. Sanctuary was not a pardon. It was a choice between the dungeon and a life of permanent, penniless exile. This whole system reveals a world filled with stark black and white contrasts. You had the king's justice, which was brutal and often deadly, centered around the dungeon and the gallows. And you had God's justice, which offered a brief moment of mercy and a choice, albeit a grim one, within the sanctuary of the church. For the common person, life was a careful navigation between these two powerful and often competing forces. A single misstep could lead you down the path to the cold stone steps of the dungeon, while a desperate sprint could lead you to the temporary safety of the church doors. Life was precarious, and the line between freedom and confinement was a thin one you walked every day. The dungeon also played a role in the world of medieval warfare, specifically during a siege. When an army laid siege to a castle, the goal was to force the defenders to surrender. This was often a long and drawn-out affair. If the attacking army managed to capture some of the castle's defenders during a raid, they might use them as a bargaining chip or as a tool of psychological warfare. The prisoners might be tortured within earshot of the castle walls, their screams intended to demoralize their comrades. Or, in a particularly brutal display of power, the attackers might execute the prisoners in full view of the defenders, a grim message about the fate that awaited them if they did not surrender. From the other side, being a prisoner inside a besieged castle was its own special kind of hell. As the siege dragged on, food and water would become scarce. The prisoners in the dungeon would be the last to be fed. Their already meager rations would be cut, and then cut again, until they were given nothing at all. They would be left to slowly starve to death in the darkness, forgotten casualties in a larger conflict. If the castle fell, their fate was even worse. The victorious army, drunk on victory and thirsty for plunder, would storm the castle, often killing everyone they found. The prisoners in the dungeon would be helpless, trapped in their cells as the chaos raged above, waiting for the moment when the soldiers would come for them. The dungeon was also a place of secrets. It was where a lord might quietly dispose of a political rival without the messiness of a public trial. It was where inconvenient heirs could be made to disappear. It was a place where secrets were extracted through interrogation, and where other secrets were buried forever with the bodies of those who knew them. The dungeon was the ultimate tool of deniability. What happened in its depths was unseen and unheard. A prisoner could simply disappear, and the official story could be that they had escaped or died of a sudden illness. The stone walls did not just hold prisoners, they held the dark and dirty secrets of the people in power. So as we draw our journey to a close, it's worth reflecting on the sheer resilience of the human spirit. In the face of all this carefully designed misery, the cold, the dark, the hunger, the filth, the fear, the hopelessness, some people did endure. They found ways to survive. They scratched marks on the wall to count the days. They created routines to fight the monotony. They tamed rats for company. They clung to the memories of their former lives like a precious treasure. They found ways to hold on to a tiny, flickering spark of their own humanity in a place that was designed to extinguish it completely. This resilience is, perhaps, the most powerful and enduring story of the dungeon. It is not a story about adventure or escape, but a quiet story of human endurance. It is a testament to our ability to adapt, to find meaning in meaninglessness, and to hope in the face of utter despair. It is the story of the mind's incredible power to create an internal world of freedom, even when the body is locked in chains. This is not to romanticize the suffering, which was real and terrible. It is simply to acknowledge that even in the deepest, darkest pit that humans could devise, the will to live and to remain human was a powerful and defiant force. The physical structures of the medieval dungeon are mostly ruins now. We can visit them as tourists, walk through the empty cells, and try to imagine what it was like. But the distance of centuries makes it difficult to truly comprehend the reality. We are separated by our modern understanding of hygiene, of medicine, of human rights. It is easy to look at it as a piece of ancient, brutal history, something that belongs to a different and more savage world. But the ideas that built the dungeon are not so alien. The fear of the other, the desire to control and punish, the willingness to dehumanize those we consider our enemies, these are not relics of the past. The dungeon is more than just a historical topic. It is a cautionary tale. It is a reminder of what can happen when power is unchecked, when justice is arbitrary, and when society decides that some people are disposable. It shows how easily a system of cruelty can become normalized, accepted as just the way things are. The jailer who becomes indifferent to suffering, the judge who sentences a man to an ordeal, the lord who lets a prisoner starve to make a political point, these were not necessarily monsters. They were ordinary people who had become cogs in a monstrous machine. The dungeon reminds us that such machines can be built in any era if we are not vigilant. So when we think back on that initial question, could you survive a day in a medieval dungeon? We realize the answer is far more complex than a simple yes or no. The physical survival is only the first part of the challenge. The true challenge is psychological. Could you survive the absolute darkness and the loss of time? Could you survive the constant hunger and the gnawing of the rats? Could you survive the crushing loneliness and the constant nagging fear? Could you survive the complete loss of your own identity? Could you endure the slow, methodical process of being erased from the world? The experience would change you in fundamental ways. You would learn the true meaning of cold, of hunger, of fear. You would come to understand the incredible value of a single ray of sunlight, a clean drink of water, a kind word. You would be stripped of everything we use to define ourselves, our job, our family, our possessions, and be forced to confront the raw, essential core of your own consciousness. To survive the dungeon would be to undergo a kind of terrible and unwanted enlightenment, a journey into the darkest parts of the human experience that would leave you scarred, but perhaps also with a profound and unshakable appreciation for the simple, fragile beauty of a normal life. Let's not forget the smell. It would be the last thing you would ever truly forget. Long after you were released, a certain kind of damp, musty odor could transport you back in an instant. The smell of decay would be imprinted in your memory, a phantom scent that would haunt you for the rest of your days. It was the perfume of the place, the olfactory signature of despair. It was the smell of human misery, concentrated and left to ripen in the dark. To have survived the dungeon would be to have that smell as a permanent, invisible companion, a constant reminder of the place you were and the person you had to become to get out. The dungeon existed as a perfectly closed system. It took in human beings and produced suffering. That was its function. It was brutally efficient. It required very little upkeep. It ran on the simple, renewable energies of human cruelty and indifference. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of misery. The guards became brutalized by their work, the prisoners were broken by their confinement, and the society outside learned to look the other way. It was a dark engine at the heart of the medieval world, humming along quietly in the foundations of the great castles and cathedrals, doing its grim and necessary work. The true horror of the dungeon, then, is not the chains or the rats or even the darkness. It is the simple, cold, bureaucratic indifference of it all. It was not a place of chaotic, passionate evil. It was a place of methodical, organized, and soul-crushing despair. You were not being tormented by a monster, you were being processed by a system. Your suffering was not personal, it was procedural. This cold, impersonal nature of the cruelty is perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. It was a business, and the product was the slow and efficient destruction of a human being. So, as you settle into the comfort of your own bed, in your own safe and quiet room, take a moment to appreciate the profound luxury of it. The softness of your pillow, the warmth of your blanket, the simple, miraculous absence of fear. The world of the medieval dungeon seems impossibly distant, a nightmare from a forgotten age. But the memory of it serves a purpose. It is a dark benchmark against which we can measure our own progress. It is a story that reminds us that the concepts of justice, mercy, and human dignity are not givens. They are fragile things, hard-won over centuries, and they are always, always worth defending. Let's linger for a moment on the idea of the dungeon's legacy, not in our minds, but in the physical world. What happened to these spaces when they were no longer needed for their grim purpose? Castles evolved, methods of warfare changed. The legal system, slowly and painfully, began to transform. The dungeon, that essential piece of medieval architecture, became obsolete. But the space itself, the deep, cold, stone-lined hole in the ground, remained, and so it was repurposed. The oubliette that once held a forgotten political prisoner became a convenient place to dump rubbish. The series of cells that once echoed with moans became a wine cellar, the constant cool temperature being perfect for aging barrels of claret. The place of ultimate horror became a place of mundane utility. There is a profound and quiet irony in this. A tour guide in a restored castle today might point to a dark vaulted chamber and say, "And this is where they stored the wine." They might not know, or they might choose not to mention, that 100 years before the first wine barrel was rolled in, that same space was where a man slowly went mad from the dark and the damp. The walls that once absorbed the sounds of human agony now absorbed the rich, fruity smell of fermenting grapes. History is a process of paving over the past. We turn places of horror into places of storage, places of execution into public squares. The dungeon's final act of forgetting was to be forgotten itself, its original purpose papered over with a new, more palatable one. This transformation speaks to our deep-seated need to sanitize our own history. It is uncomfortable to live with the ghosts of the past. It is easier to think of the castle as a romantic place of knights and ladies than as a machine that included a sophisticated torture chamber in its basement. So, we change the story. We call the dungeon the Undercroft or the Cellars. We focus on its later, more benign uses. We scrub the stone clean of its historical stain, but the stone remembers. The cold that emanates from the walls is a memory of a time before the wine, a time of chains and fear. The dungeon may be empty, but its presence, its original and terrible purpose, still lingers there in the quiet and the dark. Archaeology has become one of the few ways we can force these stones to speak. When archaeologists excavate the floors of these forgotten cells, they find the grim reality that the tourist brochures leave out. They find the physical evidence of the suffering. They unearth layers of compacted filth containing human and animal bones, fragments of coarse pottery from broken food bowls, and the rusted remains of chains. Sometimes, they find skeletons, the bodies of prisoners who were never given a proper burial, simply left where they fell or covered with a thin layer of earth. These finds are a direct physical link to the past, a way of confirming that the stories are not just stories. The misery was real, and it left a tangible record in the soil. One of the most poignant discoveries that can be made in a former prison cell is graffiti. Not the modern kind, but the faint, desperate scratching left by the prisoners themselves. Using a loose stone or perhaps a piece of bone, a prisoner might scratch their name into the wall. A simple, defiant act of saying, "I was here. I existed." They might carve a cross, a symbol of their faith and a plea for divine mercy. Or they might simply keep a tally of the days, a series of vertical lines that represent their slow, agonizing passage through a timeless void. These faint markings are voices from the past, the last will and testament of the forgotten. They are a fragile but powerful testament to the human need to leave a mark, to resist the total erasure that the dungeon was designed to achieve. The skeletons found in dungeons tell their own silent stories. A forensic anthropologist can read the bones like a book. They can see the signs of severe malnutrition in the arrested development of the skeleton. They can see the evidence of diseases like scurvy and rickets, which leave their distinctive marks on the bone. They can identify healed or unhealed fractures, the result of torture or beatings. They can sometimes even determine the cause of death. These skeletons are the final, irrefutable witnesses. They provide a stark, scientific counterbalance to the romanticized myths. They are the physical proof that the dungeon was not a place of adventure. It was a place of slow, systematic, and scientifically verifiable destruction of the human body. So if this system was so brutal, and in many ways so inefficient, why did it eventually fade away? It was not a single event, but a long, slow evolution of thought. The ideas of the Enlightenment, in the 17th and 18th centuries, began to challenge the very foundations of the medieval worldview. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria in Italy and John Howard in England began to argue that punishment should be rational, humane, and proportional to the crime. They argued that torture was not only cruel, but also an ineffective way to find the truth. They began to promote the radical idea that a prisoner was still a human being, with certain basic rights. These were revolutionary ideas, and they slowly began to chip away at the ancient foundations of the dungeon system. John Howard, in particular, was a pivotal figure. He was a sheriff who was so horrified by the conditions he witnessed in his local jail that he dedicated his life to prison reform. He traveled all over Britain and Europe, meticulously documenting the squalor, the disease, and the corruption he found. He published his findings in a landmark book, The State of the Prisons, which shocked society and spurred the first real legislative efforts at reform. He was not a wild-eyed radical. He was a practical man who argued for basic standards of hygiene, for the separation of different classes of prisoners, and for the abolition of the fee-based system that preyed on the poor. He was one of the first people to shine a bright, empirical light into the darkest corners of the justice system. The result of this new thinking was the birth of the modern prison, the penitentiary. The idea was to create a new kind of institution, one based not on forgetting and punishment, but on penitence and reform. The early penitentiaries were highly ordered environments. Prisoners were kept in individual cells, not to be forgotten, but to reflect on their crimes. They were given work to do, and they were subjected to a rigid routine of silence and religious instruction. The goal was to break their old criminal habits and rebuild them as disciplined, productive members of society. In theory, it was a more humane and rational system. The reality, of course, was often just a different kind of psychological cruelty, but it marked a fundamental shift away from the purely punitive logic of the medieval dungeon. The old dungeons did not disappear overnight. The transition was slow and uneven. For a long time, The old system and the new existed side by side. A new, reformed prison might be built in a city, while the old, decrepit dungeon in the local castle continued to operate as it had for centuries. But the direction of history was clear. Society was slowly moving away from the idea of justice as a terrifying, arbitrary, and divinely ordained spectacle, and towards the idea of justice as a rational, bureaucratic, and state-administered system. The medieval dungeon, with its oubliettes and its trials by ordeal, was a relic of a world that was fading away. Its time was coming to an end. This brings us back to our modern fascination with the dungeon. Why, when the reality was so grim, do we find the fantasy version so appealing? In our games and our stories, the dungeon is a place of challenge, but it is a challenge that can be overcome. It has a logic. The traps can be disarmed. The monsters can be defeated. The puzzles can be solved. The fantasy dungeon is a fair fight. It is a place where cleverness, strength, and courage are rewarded. It provides a clear, understandable, and ultimately winnable contest. This is a profound psychological comfort. It is the exact opposite of the real medieval dungeon, which was an unfair, illogical, and unwinnable system of slow, bureaucratic grinding. The fantasy dungeon is a place of secrets and rewards. Behind a crumbling wall, you might find a hidden passage. In a dusty chest, you might find a magic sword or a bag of gold. Every dark corner holds the promise of discovery. The real dungeon held no secrets, only suffering. There was no treasure, only filth. The only discovery you were likely to make was a new species of biting insect or a new depth of your own despair. Our fantasy dungeons are an act of profound wishful thinking. We have taken a place of absolute hopelessness and reimagined it as a place of endless possibility. We have replaced the grim reality of administrative cruelty with the thrilling romance of heroic adventure. Our fictional hero who is thrown into a dungeon always finds a way out. He picks the lock with a hidden pin. He befriends a wise old prisoner who knows the castle's secret tunnels. He overpowers the dim-witted guard. His imprisonment is never the end of his story. It is simply the beginning of the second act. It is a temporary setback that serves to make his eventual triumph all the more glorious. This narrative is deeply appealing because it reinforces our belief in human agency, in our ability to control our own destiny. The truth of the real dungeon is a much more difficult story to accept. It is a story about the complete and total absence of agency, a story where the hero does not win, but simply wastes away, forgotten in the dark. And so, we can see that our modern pop culture dungeon is not a reflection of history, but a reaction against it. It is a sanitized, gamified, and ultimately safe version of a reality that was too terrible to contemplate. We play in the fantasy dungeon precisely because it is not real. It gives us a controlled, manageable dose of fear and excitement, without any of the real-world consequences of starvation, disease, and psychological collapse. It is a safe playground of horrors, a theme park ride that gives us the illusion of danger while keeping us perfectly secure. It is a way for us to touch the darkness of the past without getting our hands dirty. The core difference lies in a single, simple concept: boredom. The fantasy dungeon is exciting. The real dungeon was, above all else, crushingly, soul-destroyingly boring. It was a place where nothing ever happened. The same darkness, the same sounds, the same hunger, day after day, week after week, year after year. The greatest enemy was not a monster or a guard. It was the suffocating, relentless monotony of an existence that had been stripped of all meaning, variety, and purpose. This is a truth that is too grim for our adventure stories. There is no glory in dying of boredom. There is no heroism in slowly losing your mind to the endless, repetitive drip of water in the dark. The dungeon, then, was not just an attack on the body. It was a systematic war against the mind's need for stimulation. Our brains are wired to seek out novelty, to process new information, to engage with the world. The dungeon was an environment of near-total sensory deprivation, designed to starve the brain. In this vacuum, the mind would begin to eat itself, turning to hallucination, obsession, and despair. The true horror was not the dramatic moments of torture, but the long, empty, silent spaces in between. It was a quiet, subtle, and brutally effective form of psychological warfare, waged not with weapons, but with the simple, heavy reality of nothingness. The next time you see a dungeon in a movie or a game, with its flickering torches, its skeletons artfully arranged in chains, and its conveniently placed secret levers, you can appreciate it for what it is: a beautiful and comforting lie. It is a piece of fiction designed to entertain us, not to educate us. The truth is much quieter, much sadder, and much more mundane. The truth is a man shivering alone in the perfect dark, his mind slowly unraveling, not because of a dragon, but because of the profound and unending absence of everything. He is not a hero on a quest. He is a piece of administrative paperwork, waiting to be processed. The final, crucial element of the dungeon system was the law itself. The law was not a shield for the innocent. It was a weapon for the powerful. It was a complex and often contradictory set of rules that could be bent and interpreted to suit the needs of those in charge. Accusations were easy to make and almost impossible to disprove. Concepts like innocent until proven guilty did not exist. If you were accused of a crime, especially a crime against a person of higher social standing, you were effectively presumed to be guilty. The dungeon was the place where that presumption was made real, the physical manifestation of your lack of rights. Let's consider the power of a simple accusation. A business rival could accuse you of fraud. A neighbor with whom you had a land dispute could accuse you of theft. In an age of superstition, a person you had offended could accuse you of witchcraft, with no police force to investigate, and a legal system that relied on ordeals and confessions. Such an accusation could be a death sentence. Your accuser did not need proof. They only needed to be more credible than you, which often simply meant being wealthier or of a higher social rank. The dungeon was full of people who were not necessarily criminals, but who had simply had the misfortune of making the wrong enemy. This legal precariousness meant that everyone, no matter their station, lived with a low-level hum of fear. The favor of a lord could be lost. Political winds could shift. A failed harvest could lead to accusations of hoarding. The world was unstable, and the dungeon was the ultimate symbol of that instability. It was the place you ended up when your luck ran out. This is a profound difference from our modern world, where, for all its flaws, the rule of law provides a certain level of predictability and protection. In the medieval period, the law was not a wall, it was a net, and anyone could find themselves entangled in it with very little warning. And what of the idea of escape? We have touched on its futility, but it is worth examining why it was so rare. It was not just about the thick walls and the locked doors. It was about the world outside. If, by some miracle, you did manage to get out of the dungeon, where would you go? You were a fugitive. Your name and description would be known. Anyone who helped you could be severely punished. You had no money, no food, and you were likely in a terrible physical condition. The world outside the dungeon was, in its own way, just as hostile. There were no friendly farmhouses to take you in. There was no wilderness to disappear into that wasn't owned by a lord who would be duty-bound to hunt you down. The very concept of identity was different. You did not have a portable, anonymous identity as we do today. You were known by your face, your name, and your village. To be a stranger was to be an object of immediate suspicion. A lone person on the road, dressed in rags and looking half-starved, would be immediately stopped and questioned. The social fabric was tight, and anyone who did not have a clear place within it was seen as a threat. The true prison was not just the cell, it was the rigid, ordered, and deeply suspicious society that existed outside its walls. For the escaped prisoner, freedom was just a different kind of cage. a larger and more exposed one. This is why, for many, the idea of escape was a foolish dream. The smarter bet, if you had the resources, was to work within the system, to bribe the guards for small comforts, to send messages to your family, urging them to raise a ransom, or to petition a powerful lord on your behalf, to hope for a pardon or a change in your legal fortunes. The path to freedom was not through a secret tunnel, but through the slow, frustrating, and corrupt channels of money and influence. It was a game of patience and politics, not a game of daring and adventure. The most successful prisoners were not the strongest, but the richest and the best connected. So as we bring our journey to its final moments, let's return to you. You are no longer in the cell. You are out, in the blinding light of the world. But the dungeon is a part of you now. It has taught you a series of hard and unforgettable lessons. It has taught you that justice is a fragile concept. It has taught you that the human body is a frail and vulnerable thing. And it has taught you that the human mind, when starved of all input, will create its own terrifying worlds. You have learned the true value of things you once took for granted: a dry place to sleep, a clean drink of water, a moment of silence that is not filled with dread. The experience would leave you with a profound and unsettling wisdom. You would have seen the absolute bottom of the world, the place where all the rules of society and decency break down. You would have an understanding of fear that is not theoretical, but visceral and bone deep. This knowledge would set you apart from other people. You would listen to their everyday complaints and concerns about the weather, about the price of goods, and it would all seem trivial, the chatter of a world that does not understand how thin the floor beneath its feet truly is. You would be a visitor from another, darker country, a permanent exile in the land of the living. The dungeon ultimately was a place that forced a confrontation with the self, stripped of all distractions, all social roles, all possessions. A prisoner was left with nothing but the contents of their own mind. For some, this would lead to madness. For others, it might lead to a kind of profound, unwanted clarity. You would be forced to reckon with every choice you had ever made, every memory, every regret. The darkness would become a mirror, reflecting a version of yourself that you could no longer ignore. To survive the dungeon was not just to survive the physical conditions, it was to survive this intense and unforgiving process of self-examination, and to emerge on the other side with your sanity, however battered, still intact. The sheer physical effort of survival is something we often overlook. The constant shivering from the cold was not just uncomfortable, it burned a huge number of calories. The endless battle with fleas and lice was exhausting. The effort of digesting the foul, indigestible food took a toll on the body. Life in the dungeon was a constant, low-level physical struggle that drained your energy. Day by day, it was a war of attrition, and the dungeon had all the advantages. It was patient, relentless, and it never got tired. It was a system designed to wear you down, to exhaust you into submission or into the grave. Let's consider one last small detail: the sounds of the guards. They would be your only regular human contact, but a strange and distant one. You would learn to distinguish their footsteps: the heavy, deliberate tread of the guard bringing food, the quicker, lighter steps of a different guard on his rounds. You would hear them talking to each other in the corridor, their voices muffled and indistinct. You might catch a snatch of a joke or a complaint about their work. These small, mundane sounds from the world of the living would be both a comfort and a torment. They were a reminder that a normal world still existed, just a few feet away, on the other side of a thick oak door. This proximity to normality was one of the dungeon's cruelest tricks. You were not in a distant, forgotten land. You were right there, in the foundations of the very building where society's powerful ate, slept, and conducted their business. You were a part of the same ecosystem, just the lowest, most forgotten part. This was not about banishing you to the wilderness, It was about holding you in a state of suspended animation right in the heart of the community, a living ghost haunting the basement. It was a constant physical reminder of the social order. Some people live in the light, and some people are kept in the dark. The story of the dungeon is not, in the end, a story about monsters. There were no dragons, no goblins. The monsters in this story were all human. They were the indifferent lord, the greedy jailer, the false accuser, the torturer who was just doing his job. And the system itself was the greatest monster of all, a mindless, grinding machine built of laws, customs, and stones. It is a story about the terrifyingly ordinary nature of cruelty, about how easy it is for people to create and maintain systems of profound suffering, simply by accepting them as normal. The dungeon was not an aberration. It was a perfectly logical, if horrifying, expression of the world that built it. The air of the dungeon had a weight to it, a physical presence. It was old air, breathed and rebreathed by generations of the suffering. It was air that had never known the cleansing power of the sun or the wind. Breathing it was like drinking from a stagnant pool. It filled your lungs with the microscopic particles of damp, mold, and decay. This constant inhalation of foulness would have had a profound physiological effect, contributing to the chronic lung ailments that plagued so many prisoners. Your very breath, the most essential act of life, became a way of drawing the prison deeper and deeper into the core of your own body. You were not just in the dungeon was in you. Imagine the moment when a long-term prisoner was told they were being released. It might not be a moment of pure joy. It would be a moment of profound shock and disbelief. Hope was a dangerous thing in the dungeon, a feeling to be suppressed, because it only led to disappointment. After years of hopelessness, the sudden news of freedom would be a disorienting, almost frightening event. The prisoner would have adapted to their confinement. The cell, for all its horrors, had become predictable, its routines known. The outside world was now a place of terrifying uncertainty. Freedom would feel less like a release and more like an eviction into a world they no longer understood. The concept of home would have been transformed. The prisoner would have spent years dreaming of their home, building it up in their mind into a perfect, mythical place of warmth and safety. The reality, upon their return, could never live up to this fantasy. The real home would be smaller, messier, and more complicated than the one in their memory. The people in it would have aged and changed. This disconnect between the perfect home of their dreams and the imperfect reality would be a final, subtle cruelty of their long imprisonment. They had survived the dungeon, only to find that the sanctuary they had been fighting to return to existed only in their own mind. Let's talk about the silence again. Not the sounds of the dungeon, but the silence of the world outside. The prisoner was forgotten, but they had not forgotten. They would lie in the dark and think about their family. Were they safe? Were they healthy? Did they still remember them? This total lack of information was a form of torture. The prisoner's mind would be filled with 1,000 terrible possibilities, with no way of knowing what was true. The dungeon did not just sever your physical connection to the world, it severed your emotional and informational connection as well, leaving you to float in a void of fearful speculation, a universe where your loved ones existed only as fading memories and constant, gnawing worries. For the prisoner who had a family, the greatest fear was not for themselves, but for their loved ones. If they were in prison for debt, they knew their family was likely starving. If they were in prison for a political crime, they knew their family might be in danger of reprisal. Their own suffering would be magnified 1,000 times by the knowledge that their confinement was causing suffering for the people they loved. This feeling of helpless responsibility, of being the cause of your family's ruin while being utterly powerless to help them, would be a psychological burden heavier than any iron chain. It was a way of punishing not just the prisoner, but everyone they cared about. The dungeon was also a place of rumors and misinformation. A new prisoner might bring news from the outside world, but it would be fragmented, out of date, and unreliable. A guard might drop a cryptic hint about a political change or a new law, perhaps just to toy with the prisoners' emotions. The inmates would be starved for information, and they would cling to any scrap, trying to piece together a picture of the world they could no longer see. This created an environment of constant speculation and false hope. The dungeon was a rumor mill, a dark echo chamber where whispers and lies could grow into monstrous certainties, another subtle way of keeping the prisoners' minds off balance and in a state of perpetual anxiety. The very floor of the dungeon was a historical document. Over the centuries, a thick, stratified layer of refuse would build up. An archaeologist carefully excavating this floor could read it like tree rings. A layer of straw from a time when the jailer was feeling generous. A layer of animal bones from a particularly harsh winter. The compacted filth was the physical archive of the dungeon's history, a disgusting but eloquent testament to the lives and deaths that had taken place upon it. Each layer was a story, a season of suffering, a generation of forgotten souls, all compressed under the weight of time into a single, solid mass of misery. The dungeon was a perfect symbol of the medieval social order. It was the physical foundation upon which the glittering superstructure of the castle was built. Its darkness was necessary for the light above to seem so bright. Its misery was the price that was paid for the comfort and security of the ruling class. It was not an anomaly. It was an essential and integral part of the system. Without the dungeon and the fear it represented, the entire feudal pyramid of power would have been less stable. It was the ultimate threat, the final argument in any political or legal dispute, the dark, silent partner in the business of governing. The experience would fundamentally alter your relationship with your own body. You would learn to read its subtle signals in a new way. The grumble of your stomach, the ache in your joints, the heat of a fever. These would become the most important events in your world. You would become a reluctant expert in your own slow decay. This intense inward focus, this constant monitoring of your own physical state, was a consequence of having your external world reduced to almost nothing. Your body was not just your prison. It was also your entire universe, a small, fragile, and endlessly fascinating kingdom of pain. The end of a prisoner's life in the dungeon was often not a dramatic event. It was a quiet fading. They would grow weaker and weaker, until one day they simply did not have the energy to lift their head, or to eat the meager crust of bread left for them. They would slip from consciousness into a final, merciful darkness. The guards would find them a day or two later. There would be no inquest, no ceremony. The body would be dragged out and disposed of. In the official records, if any were kept, the entry would be simple: died of a wasting sickness. It was a quiet, bureaucratic end to a life that had been filled with a quiet, bureaucratic suffering. The system had completed its work. Let's consider the water one last time. That constant, rhythmic drip. It was the dungeon's heartbeat. It was the only thing that was constant in a world of uncertainty. It was the clock that measured out the long, empty hours. A prisoner might come to hate that sound with a burning passion, its maddening regularity, a symbol of their endless confinement. Or they might come to find a strange comfort in it. It was a predictable sound in an unpredictable world. It was a proof that time was, in fact, still passing. The drip was both the torment and the anchor, the sound of their prison, and the only thing that kept them tethered to the flow of reality. The medieval world was a world of sharp, clear smells, the scent of wood smoke, of livestock, of baking bread, of rain on dry earth. The dungeon was the negation of all this. Its smell was a monotonous, one-note symphony of decay. It was the smell of things that were not alive and growing, but dead and rotting. To be in the dungeon was to be removed from the complex, vibrant, and living smells of the world, and to be submerged in the singular, oppressive smell of death. This olfactory deprivation was another small, subtle way that the prison cut you off from the very essence of a living world. The idea of a fair trial is a cornerstone of modern justice. The dungeon existed in a world that had a completely different concept. A trial was not necessarily about discovering objective truth. It was often a public performance, a ritual designed to demonstrate the power of the Lord and to reinforce the social order. The outcome was often decided long before the trial began. The dungeon was where you were held while you waited for this piece of theater to be staged. You were not a participant in a search for justice. You were a prop, waiting for your cue to be brought onto the stage and play your assigned role as the convicted criminal. When we think of castles, we think of the high towers, the grand halls, the battlements. We look up. The dungeon forces us to look down. It forces us to acknowledge the dark, hidden, and unpleasant foundations of that world. It is a reminder that the glories of the past were often built upon a bedrock of profound human suffering. The history of the dungeon is the history of the powerless, the forgotten, the losers of history. It is a necessary and uncomfortable counterpoint to the triumphant stories of kings and knights that we are more familiar with. It is the history from below, literally and figuratively. The ultimate psychological weapon of the dungeon was its ability to make you feel like you had ceased to be a person. You were a number, a body in a cell, an entry in a ledger. This process of dehumanization was essential for the system to function. It allowed the guards to treat you with indifference, it allowed the Lord to forget you, and it allowed society to accept your fate. And the most terrible part of this process was that, over time, you might start to believe it yourself. You might start to forget the person you once were, and to accept the new identity the dungeon had given you, the identity of a forgotten thing, rotting in the dark. Let us imagine one final scene. A very old man is sitting by a fire. His grandchildren are playing on the floor. He is quiet and he has a distant look in his eyes. When he was a young man, he spent 5 years in a dungeon. He has never spoken of it, but he carries it with him every day. It is in the way he eats his food too quickly. It is in the way he startles at loud noises. It is in the way he sometimes just sits and stares into the darkness outside the window. He survived. He is free. He has a family. But a part of him never left that cell. A part of him is still down there, in the cold and the dark, listening to the drip of water. The dungeon, then, is a story without a clean ending. There is no triumph, no final victory. Even for the survivor, the experience is a wound that never fully heals. It is a ghost that walks beside them for the rest of their days. This is perhaps the most honest and important lesson of all. Some things, once they are broken, can never be perfectly mended. Some experiences change us so profoundly that we can never go back to being the person we were before. The dungeon was not just a place. It was a transformation, a brutal alchemy that turned people into something else. Survivors, ghosts, cautionary tales. And so we see that the romantic myth of the dungeon is a shield. It protects us from the quiet, boring, and bureaucratic horror of the real thing. It gives us heroes and monsters, adventure and treasure, where in reality there was only monotony, filth, and despair. We prefer the exciting lie to the grim truth, because the truth is too much to bear. The truth is that one of the most effective forms of human cruelty is not dramatic violence, but the slow, patient, and administrative process of making a person simply cease to matter. The true answer to the question, could you survive, is that, in a way, nobody did. The person who entered the dungeon was not the same person who left, if they left at all. A part of them, their innocence, their trust in the world, their sense of safety, died down there in the dark. The survivor was a new person, forged in that cold, dark crucible. A person who knew things about the world and about themselves that they would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. Survival was not a victory. but a life sentence of a different kind. And so, as our story ends, let the darkness of your own room feel like a comfort, not a threat. Let the quiet be a peaceful silence, not a menacing one. The reality of the dungeon was not an exciting nightmare, but a dull and grinding misery. A place where the greatest horror was not what would happen tomorrow, but the grim certainty that it would be exactly the same as today. And in that knowledge, perhaps you can find a deeper appreciation for the simple, profound, and beautiful reality of a new day. Now, let the story fade and ease into a quiet and peaceful sleep.